It is the night of the 6th of January in the year 878, and at the royal hall of Chippenham the Christmas feasting is winding down into that soft, tired, satisfied lull that comes at the end of Twelfth Night. The candles guttering low in their iron sconces, the last cups of mead going round, someone's hound stretched out too close to the hearth, dreaming of bones. King Alfred of Wessex, 29 years old, not yet the man history will one day call the Great, is somewhere in that warm timber hall. Surrounded by his thanes and his household, the smoke curling up into the dark rafters, the 12 days of feasting behind him, and he no doubt hopes a quiet winter ahead. He has no reason yet to think this will be the worst night of his life. And then, out of the frozen dark beyond the palisade, Guthrum's Danish army comes down on Chippenham like the winter itself had turned into men with axes. It is a surprise attack, timed with a cold and deliberate cruelty. Nobody makes war in midwinter. That was simply not done. Which is rather the point, because the Danes had noticed that nobody else was doing it. Doors are broken. Firelight spills out into the snow. And somewhere in that chaos, the king of the last free Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England, the only English kingdom left standing against the Great Heathen Army that had already swallowed Northumbria. East Anglia and Mercia whole is forced out into the freezing night with only a small band of men around him, a fugitive in his own country. His hall lost, his Christmas guests scattered or dead or fled overseas, and absolutely no idea as he stumbles away through the dark. That he is about to become one of the most quietly stubborn men in English history. That is where we are tonight. That is the England you're about to step into. Cold, uncertain, and hanging by a thread. And I promise you, it gets warmer from here, both literally and otherwise. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, go ahead and drop your location and your local time down in the comments just so we can all quietly picture each other drifting off together across whatever time zone you happen to be curled up in tonight. Now. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because you are not staying in that burning hall tonight. You're slipping backward, gently, the way sleep pulls you backward, past the smoke and the shouting, past the frozen January fields around Chippenham, and out into the wider kingdom of Wessex as it was in the January of 878, a kingdom that, for one very bad winter, must have felt like it was the last candle left burning in a very large, very dark room. You feel the cold first. Not a sharp cold, not the kind that bites, but a slow, patient cold that has settled into the ground and the thatch and the stone of the churches. The kind of cold that makes breath hang in the air like a small ghost in front of your face. You are walking, or perhaps riding. If you are lucky enough to have a shaggy, sturdy pony under you, along a rutted track somewhere in the chalk hills of Wessex, and the world around you is almost entirely dark. Lit only by a thin scrape of moon, and far off, the orange smudge of a hearth fire glowing faintly through the smoke hole of some farmer's roof. There are no streetlights here, obviously, because there are no streets, not in the way you're used to, and there is certainly no one waiting up for the news. because the news that the king has been driven from his own hall has not yet finished travelling from village to village. Carried on foot and on horseback by men whose job it is to know things and pass them on before the Danes do. You pull your cloak tighter, the wool damp and heavy with the night air, and you notice how quiet the land is. Quiet in the particular way that frightened places go quiet, everyone indoors, everyone listening. Somewhere behind you, in a marsh you have not yet reached and cannot yet imagine. A king with a small and shrinking following of loyal men is about to vanish into the wetlands of Somerset so thoroughly that for months the rest of England will not be entirely sure whether he's alive. That is not tonight's story, not quite yet. Tonight you're simply arriving, easing yourself down into the cold and the dark and the smell of wood smoke and wet earth that is Wessex in the dead of winter. The last free English kingdom, small, frightened, and, though nobody in it knows this yet, about to produce one of the great comeback stories of the early medieval world. It is a strange thing, isn't it, to think that an entire nation's fate can turn on one long, cold, undignified winter spent hiding. Historians still argue over whether that night at Chippenham was quite as sudden a surprise as the old chronicles make it sound, or whether Alfred had some warning and simply misjudged how bad it would be. The sources, written decades later by men who wanted their king to look heroic rather than caught flat-footed over his Christmas pudding, are not exactly neutral witnesses. What is not in doubt is the scale of what followed. This was, by 878, the fourth English kingdom the Great Heathen Army had brought to its knees, after Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia had each in turn fallen or submitted, which made Wessex not merely one kingdom among several, but quite literally, the entire remaining hope for an independent English monarchy anywhere on the island. And here is a small, almost comic detail buried in all that grimness. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us the Danes struck in midwinter, specifically because midwinter campaigning simply was not how war was conducted, which meant Alfred's court had let its guard down for the holidays in exactly the way you might let your own guard. Down for a long weekend, only for him the consequence was losing an entire kingdom overnight rather than, say, misplacing the good corkscrew. You settle deeper into your cloak, deeper into the dark, and somewhere ahead of you the shape of that whole cold, muddy, firelit kingdom begins to take form, its chalk downs, its river valleys, its old Roman roads gone soft with disuse, waiting for you to walk further in. The land opens up slowly around you, the way land does when you're moving through it on foot or on horseback rather than glancing at it from a car window. And what strikes you first is how much of Wessex is made of long rolling backs of chalk, the downs pale and bare under the winter sky, rising and falling like something enormous asleep beneath a thin green blanket. This is the 9th of January, or near enough, and you are threading your way through a kingdom that stretches from the Thames Valley in the north and east down through Hampshire, Wiltshire, Dorset, Somerset, Devon and the western edges of the old Cornish lands, a broad crescent of territory that has, in the space of one very bad winter, become something it never quite planned to be. The last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing in the whole of England. Northumbria fell years ago, East Anglia fell, and its king, Edmund, was killed for refusing to renounce his faith. a story the monks tell with a kind of hushed, careful reverence. Mercia's king fled the country entirely in 874, and the Danes have since propped up their own puppet ruler there. Which leaves Wessex, this long chalky spine of a kingdom you're walking through right now, as the only piece of English ground still answering to an English king. And after Chippenham, even that claim is hanging by the thinnest of threads. You come down off the high open downland into a river valley. And the whole feel of the world changes with the elevation, the way it always does. Up on the chalk, the wind has been steady and cold and faintly abrasive. Carrying nothing much but the smell of frost and dead grass. But down here, following the curve of a slow winter river, perhaps the Wylye, perhaps the upper reaches of the Avon. It hardly matters which, since these chalk streams all share a certain clear, cold, quietly self-important character. The air turns damp and mineral and rich with the smell of wet willow bark and standing water. The valley bottoms are where the settlements cluster naturally because water is life and nobody in the ninth. Sentry needs that explain to them twice, and so as you walk you begin to catch glimpses of low roofs, smoke threading up from unseen hearths. The dark shapes of alder and willow along the water's edge, bare-branched and dripping. Sheep move across a distant slope like a slow grey stain spreading over the down. And somewhere a dog barks twice and then thinks better of it. Beyond the river valleys, where the land climbs again or turns heavier and wetter, you find the forests. Not the tidy managed woodlands you might picture, but great tangled stretches of oak and ash and hazel, some of them ancient royal hunting preserves. Dense enough that a man could genuinely lose an army in them, which is worth remembering, because in a few months' time a rather important army is going to need exactly that kind of cover. The trees stand black and dripping in the winter dark, and every so often you catch the sharp, resinous smell of a woodsman's recent fire. Or the softer rot and leaf mould smell of a forest floor that has been quietly decomposing since roughly the fall of Rome. And running beneath and through all of this, cutting straight lines across a landscape that otherwise curves and wanders and generally does whatever it likes, are the old Roman roads, cracked, grass-grown. Their stone foundations still stubbornly holding after 500 years of neglect, because the Romans, whatever else you want to say about them, built things to outlast their own empire out of what appears to have been sheer spite toward future road crews. You find your feet falling into a strange, steady rhythm on those old stones, a rhythm the road itself seems to remember even if nobody walking it tonight was alive when it was laid. It is worth pausing here, in the cold and the dark, to feel the actual size of what you are walking through, because Wessex in 878 is not a small, cosy little kingdom in the way it might sound in a bedtime story. It is a real and considerable stretch of southern England, and every single hide of it, every ploughed field and grazed down and fished river, is now, quite suddenly, the entire remaining territory of independent English rule. There is something almost unbearably poignant about that. If you let yourself sit with it for a moment, the idea that the fate of an entire people's self-governance has narrowed down to this one chalky, muddy, sheep-dotted peninsula of land between the Thames and the Channel, though I suspect if you'd told the actual Anglo-Saxons of Wessex that they were living through a hinge point of English history, Most of them would have simply asked whether that meant the sheep still needed moving in the morning, because as it turns out, history rarely excuses anyone from chores. The quirky little detail worth tucking away here is that the Romans' road network, built for legions and supply wagons, was still in the 9th century one. Of the fastest ways to move a message or an army across the kingdom, the Anglo-Saxons never really built anything to match it, and simply inherited the old Roman bones of Britain and used them for their own purposes, which is either impressively resourceful or a touch cheeky, depending on your view of unpaid infrastructure. And it is genuinely true, a solid and well-attested fact, that by the time of the Chippenham attack, Wessex under Alfred and his predecessors had already fought. Something like 9 engagements against Viking forces in a single earlier year alone, so this was a kingdom that had been fighting. In fits and starts, for the better part of a decade before this particular midwinter catastrophe. Historians still argue, and probably always will, over exactly how unified or fragile Wessex truly was beneath the surface in early 878, whether the kingdom's nobles were quietly weighing their options with the Danes even as their king vanished into the marshes, or whether the loyalty Alfred later found waiting for him was there all along, simply biding its time in the cold. Either way. You keep walking down off the chalk along the old straight road into a kingdom that does not yet know how its own story ends. Eventually the road brings you close enough to a village that you can smell it before you can properly see it, which is, if you think about it, simply how villages have always worked. Wood smoke first, thick and sweet and a little acrid where it is still catching, then the warmer, earthier smell of animals and damp straw. And under all of it, something that is unmistakably a settlement of human beings who have been living in the same small cluster of buildings for generations without benefit of drainage as you. Understand the concept. The houses themselves rise up out of the dark in low, humped shapes, their walls built timber-framed with panels of wattle and daub packed in between the uprights. Woven hazel withies plastered over with a mixture of clay, straw, and, frankly, whatever else was lying around that would stick, dried hard and pale against the frame like the ribs of some large sleeping animal. The roofs are thatch, thick bundles of reed or straw layered and pinned in overlapping courses, sloping steeply down almost to head height in places. And there is something quietly reassuring about how organic the whole structure feels, less like a building and more like something that grew there. You duck through a low doorway into one of these houses, because you are cold and because the woman of the house, in the particular unhurried hospitality of the age, has simply waved you toward the fire without much ceremony, and the first thing that hits you is the smoke. Not choking, not unbearable, but a constant low, eye-stinging haze that hangs somewhere between your knees and the roof beams, because there is no chimney here, none at all, and certainly no glass in the one small unshuttered window opening. Just a hole up in the thatch where the smoke is meant to find its own way out eventually, in its own time. The way smoke does when nobody is in any particular hurry. The whole household lives in this one room, cooking, eating, sleeping, mending, arguing. All of it happening within a few feet of the same central hearth, a ring of stones on the earthen floor with a fire built up in the middle of it. Glowing orange and gently spitting, and you find yourself instinctively drawn toward it the way everyone in this room clearly has been for hours. Along one end of the room, behind a rough woven screen or a simple partition of hurdles, you can hear the soft shuffle and huff of animals, a cow, perhaps, or a few sheep. Brought in for the worst of the winter nights, not out of sentiment but out of plain thrift, because a living, breathing animal is a small furnace of its own. And nobody in the 9th century is inclined to waste free heat, least of all a heat source that also, rather conveniently, produces manure for the spring fields. If you were instead to find your way, as a traveller sometimes might, to the hall of the local thegn, the landholding warrior noble who answers for this stretch of country and owes his own service up the chain to the king, or did until the king went missing into a marsh, the scale of things changes considerably. Though the bones of the building are much the same, a thegn's hall is longer, taller, grander, its timber frame more ambitious, and along its walls hang woven hangings. Dyed wool worked into patterns, doing double duty as both decoration and a rather effective barrier against the draughts that otherwise come sliding in through every gap in the timberwork. There is a hierarchy sitting quietly and visibly over every one of these rooms, whether humble cottage or noble hall, and it is worth understanding it now in the firelight, because it shapes everything else you will see tonight. At the top sits the thegn, land-holding, sword-owning, answerable for military service and local justice, a man whose life is valued. In the cold arithmetic of Anglo-Saxon law, at some 1,200 shillings should anyone be foolish enough to kill him. Below him sits the ceorl, the free farmer, the churl in the oldest and least insulting sense of that word, a man who owns or rents his own land, works it with his own hands and his family's, and whose life is worth a more modest 200 shillings, a sum called the wergild, the man price, paid to his kin to settle a killing before it spirals into a blood feud. That nobody in a small village has the appetite for, and at the bottom, with no wergild of his own at all, sits the thrall, the unfree man or woman. Born or captured or fallen into bondage through debt, doing the hardest and least regarded labour of the household and the field, you warm your hands at the fire, and it occurs to you that the whole arrangement of ranks and prices and obligations, however harsh it can sound laid out flatly like that, is really just this society's rather blunt way of trying to keep the peace, without benefit of police, courts as you'd recognise them, or frankly patience, put a price on a life. And suddenly murder becomes an extremely expensive proposition rather than merely a moral one, which is either a grim commentary on human nature or a fairly practical bit of early legislation. Possibly both at once. It is a solid, well-documented fact that these three broad ranks, thegn, ceorl and thrall, form the basic skeleton of free and unfree society across Anglo-Saxon England. Recorded again and again in the law codes of Alfred's own house, and here is a small, quietly startling tidbit to carry with you into the smoke and the dark, a ceorl who managed to acquire enough land, enough independence, and enough standing, could in principle rise to something like thegn status over time, which means the rigid-looking hierarchy warming itself by this hearth was, in certain corners, a little more climbable than it first appears, a ladder rather than simply a wall. Historians still argue over just how common that kind of upward movement actually was in practice, and how much of it was legal theory versus lived reality for the ordinary seal sweating over his strips of barley. But the fact that the possibility existed at all tells you something about a society that, even in its bones, was already tinkering with the shape of its own rules. You settle back from the fire, the smoke stinging gently at your eyes, the animals shifting behind their screen, and somewhere outside, in the dark, the whole quiet architecture of village life goes on breathing around you. Someone has swung the cauldron in over the fire on its iron hook, and the smell that rises up from it is the smell that, more than almost anything else, would tell you exactly where and when you are. Pottage, thick and slow bubbling. A stew of whatever the household has on hand, barley or oats thickened into it along with cabbage, leeks, onions, peas, beans, parsnips, whatever the garden and the store baskets have managed to yield this deep into winter, all of it simmered down together into something warm and filling and, if you're being honest, not terribly photogenic, though nobody here is worried about how their supper looks. This is the staple, the daily bread beneath the bread. The thing that fills the belly of Then and Saul and Thrall alike in one form or another, differing mostly in how much meat, if any, has found its way into the pot, and you find yourself accepting a wooden bowl of it with both hands. Glad of the warmth soaking up through the grain of the wood into your cold fingers. Beside the pottage sits the bread, and it is worth adjusting your expectations. Here, because this is not the soft, pale, obligingly fluffy loaf you might be picturing, it is a dense, dark, coarse thing. Made from barley or rye more often than the finer wheat, which is saved where possible for better occasions, and it has a heft to it, a chewiness, that makes you understand instinctively why people of this age had, by all accounts, rather more resilient teeth than digestive comfort might otherwise suggest. You tear a piece off and dip it into the pottage, and alongside it, if the household is reasonably prosperous, there might be cheese, firm and sharp, made from the milk of whatever cow or ewe the family keeps, and perhaps a few eggs, and butter worked by hand and kept cool in a shaded corner. Meat, real meat, a joint of pork or mutton, or on a very good day beef, is a treat here. Not a given. Something salted down in the autumn slaughter to be eked out carefully across the hungry months, brought to the table sparingly. Savoured rather than assumed, which does put a certain modern habit of absent-mindedly grazing through a bag of crisps into a slightly humbling perspective. If you want anything sweet at all, and most people eventually do, there is exactly one option on offer, and that option is honey. Thick, amber, gathered from the household's own hives or traded for at a local market, stirred into things or drizzled where it can be spared. Because sugar, as you know, it simply does not exist yet in this corner of the world, will not exist here in any meaningful quantity for centuries, and so honey carries the full, undivided weight of every sweet tooth in Wessex on its slow golden shoulders. To drink you're offered ale, and you take it without hesitation. Because ale here is not really a matter of preference so much as a matter of survival. Brewed weak enough that even children drink it regularly, it is. Rather wonderfully, safer than a great deal of the standing water available, the brewing process itself doing a fair bit of quiet. Accidental public health work that nobody in this hall would think to describe in those terms, For richer or more festive occasions there is mead. Honey fermented, slow and heady, and for the truly well-off, on rare occasion, a cup of wine brought up from the south. Though that is a luxury well above the pottage and barley bread reality of most evenings in most houses. You drink from a cup made of horn, the tip of some long-departed ox or cow shaped and polished into a curved little vessel that sits strangely elegant in your cold hand, and you eat as everyone around you eats. From a shallow wooden bowl using a knife you likely carry yourself and a spoon carved from wood or horn, because forks, whatever you might be used to, have not yet made their way into this particular corner of the 9th century and will not for a very long while yet. All of this happens by firelight. Because there is no other light worth mentioning, perhaps a rushlight or two, a twist of reed dipped in animal fat and set smoking in a holder. But mostly it is the hearth fire itself doing the work, throwing long orange shadows up the wattle and daub walls and turning every face around the circle into something soft-edged and warm. The whole scene lit like the inside of a lantern. There is a companionable quiet to it, a rhythm of spoon against bowl and the low murmur of talk. And you notice, not for the first time tonight, how much of this world runs on patience. Patience for the pottage to cook. Patience for the bread to rise and bake in whatever crude oven or hearthside stone is available. Patience for the mead to ferment. Patience, above all, for winter itself to eventually loosen its grip. It is a solid and well-established fact that this diet, pottage as the daily backbone, coarse-grain bread, dairy, garden vegetables, honey as the sole sweetener, and meat carefully rationed out from the autumn's salted stores, held true across the whole spread of Anglo-Saxon society, adjusted only by wealth rather than by any real difference in kind. So that a Thane and a Seol were, in a given week, eating rather more similar meals than either of their very different guilds. Might lead you to expect. Here is a genuinely charming little tidbit to tuck away with you as you finish your bowl. Because ale was considered safer and more nourishing than plain water, it was drunk quite unself-consciously by children right alongside the adults. Which means that somewhere in Wessex tonight there is very likely a small, extremely tired child finishing a small cup of weak ale before bed, in what may be history's earliest and least effective bedtime routine. Historians still argue over just how strong that everyday ale actually was, and over how much of the population's supposedly cheerful tolerance for it reflected genuine safety concerns about the local water versus simple, long-held habit and taste. The surviving evidence leaves plenty of room for debate, and probably always will. You set your empty bowl down by the hearth, warmed through now, fed, and faintly. Pleasantly sleepy in the particular way that a heavy meal by an open fire tends to produce in anyone in any century. Outside again, and the cold meets you fresh, but you find your eyes have adjusted well enough now that the shapes of the fields around the village start to resolve themselves out of the dark, not fields in the neat, hedged, rectangular sense you might expect, but great open stretches of ploughland. Worked not as individual private plots, but as long, narrow strips scattered across shared common fields, each household holding its own scattered ribbons of land mixed in among its neighbours. A system that spreads both the good soil and the bad evenly around, rather than letting any one family hog the best of it. which is either a quietly elegant bit of medieval fairness or simply what happens when everyone in the village has to agree on crop rotation. And nobody wants to be the one left farming the boggy corner every single year. Even in the depths of winter, you can see the ghost of the summer's work. Laid out in the land itself, the long ridge strips running in their patient parallel lines up and over the gentle swell of the down. Part of the great field left deliberately fallow this year, resting, gathering its strength back for a season, because even in the 9th century people understood, if only through hard experience, that soil work too hard for too long simply gives up on you. It takes real effort to break that soil open in the first place. And if you wait and watch, you can imagine the scene as it will unfold once the frost properly lifts. A heavy plough, its iron blade and coulter cutting deep and turning the earth in a way no simple hand tool ever could, hauled forward by a team of oxen. As many as 8 of them yoked together for the heaviest, stickiest ground, plodding along in their great patient line while a ploughman walks behind. Guiding, correcting, occasionally, one imagines, muttering something to the lead ox that would not translate terribly well into polite company. Wheat goes into some of those strips. Prized above all for good bread when it can be spared from trade or tribute, and barley goes into others, doing double duty as the backbone of both loaf and ale. Along with rye and oats and the peas and beans that round out the pottage pot you supped from not long ago. Come the height of summer, all of this ripens into the harvest, the single most important stretch of days in the entire farming year. When every hand in the village, Thane's household and Chorl's family and thrall alike, more or less, since a harvest waiting on ceremony is a harvest rotting in the field, turns out to cut and gather and stack before the weather can spoil what a whole year's labour has produced, and then, as the light shortens and the year turns back toward the cold you are standing in right now, comes Blotmonth, Blood Month. The old name for what falls in what you would call November, and it is exactly as blunt and practical as it sounds. Not every animal a household owns can be fed through a whole winter. Hay and fodder only stretch so far, and so a hard, clear-eyed calculation gets made every autumn. And the animals that cannot be kept are slaughtered, the meat salted down in barrels and cured over smoke, turned into the very stores that fill that pottage pot and, on lucky days, sit as a rare joint of pork or mutton on the table you left a little while ago. It is not a sentimental business. Blood Month. But it is not a cruel one either. Not by the standards of a world that has not yet invented the luxury of pretending its food arrives from nowhere in particular. It is simply the shape winter forces onto everyone who keeps animals, a yearly reckoning between what you have and what you can actually carry through to spring. Down where the land dips toward moving water, you find the watermill, its wheel turning slow and steady in the current, doing the patient, grinding work that once, not so very long ago in the older memory of the countryside, would have been done by hand with a quernstone, one weary set of arms at a time. The mill takes the grain of the whole village or the whole estate and turns it, load by load, into the coarse flour that becomes the bread you have already tasted tonight. and there is something almost soothing in the low, constant creak and splash of it, working on through the dark, long, after the ploughmen and the harvesters have gone into their firesides. Up on the higher, rougher ground, sheep move in their patient grey clusters, valued as much for their wool as for anything else. Since wool clothes the whole kingdom in one form or another, and down in the woodland edges, out of sight just now but very much present, pigs are turned loose. To root among the fallen acorns and beechmast in a practice with its own lovely word, pannage, which sounds like something far grander than pigs eating free nuts in the mud. Though I suppose most grand-sounding words, if you trace them back far enough, turn out to be describing something fairly ordinary. It is a well-established fact. Drawn from the law codes and the land surveys of the age, that this open field system, heavy ploughs, ox teams, long shared strips, and a portion of the land always resting fallow, was the basic working machinery underneath almost the whole of Wessex's food supply. The quiet, unglamorous engine that kept Thane's Hall and Seal's Cottage alike fed through the year. Here is a genuinely delightful tidbit to carry with you as you look out over those dark, resting fields, an ox team hauling the heaviest plough could number as many as 8 animals, an entire small herd yoked together just to turn one strip of stubborn winter clay. Which makes you wonder, not unkindly, just how much patient shouting a single ploughman's working day actually required. Historians still argue over exactly how these open fields were managed village by village. Whether the familiar tidy 3-field rotation of later centuries was already firmly in place this early, or whether Wessex in Alfred's day was still working through looser, more improvised local arrangements. And the honest answer is that the evidence from 878 itself is thinner than anyone studying it would like. You stand there a moment longer, breathing in the cold. Mineral smell of turned earth and wood smoke and distant sheep, watching the mill wheel turn in the dark, and you let the whole rhythm of that farming year settle over you. Slow and certain as the seasons themselves, exactly the sort of rhythm that tends, eventually, to carry a tired mind gently off to sleep. And now that your belly is warm and the last of the pottage has gone from the bowl, let your eyes wander upward, slowly, from the table to the people sitting around it. Because what they are wearing is its own kind of quiet comfort, the sort you could almost doze off just looking at. Every stitch on every body in this hall began as something alive, a sheep sheared in early summer, a flax plant pulled and soaked and beaten half to death. In a process nobody particularly enjoyed, and by the time it reaches a shoulder here in 878, it has passed through more hands than you have fingers to count. Wool is the workhorse fabric of Wessex, spun on a drop spindle by firelight, woven on an upright loom leaned against the wall. And it becomes tunics for the men, knee-length or a little longer, belted at the waist with a strip of leather, and it becomes long, flowing gowns for the women. The kind that pull softly at the ankle and swing gently when someone crosses the room to stir the fire. Underneath all that wool, against the skin, is linen. Softer, cooler, a little kinder to wear next to the body, cut into simple undershirts for the men and long shifts for the women. And if you have ever complained about an itchy sweater, spare a thought for anyone who skipped that layer, because raw wool directly against bare skin is not an experience anyone recommends twice. The The men, when they're out working the fields or walking the muddy lanes, wear breeches or trousers under the tunic, and often their lower legs are wrapped, round and round. In long woolen strips called leg wrappings, tied off neatly at the knee with a garter, which does double duty keeping the wool close to the leg. And keeping the worst of the mud a little further away, a sensible arrangement born of a long practical experience with English lanes in a wet season. Over everything, when the weather turns, and in England the weather is always about to turn, some things never change, goes the cloak. A broad rectangle of heavy wool draped over the shoulders and pinned in place at the front or the shoulder with a brooch, and here is where you start to see. Quite plainly, who is who in this hall, because a Kjol's brooch might be a simple disc of bronze while a Then's catches the firelight in worked silver, or even gold. Set with garnet or enamel, a small stubborn advertisement of status worn every single day, whether its owner meant it that way or not. The women, over their long gowns, wear a mantle as well, another warm layer against the draughts that no amount of thatch and wattle ever quite manages to keep out. And their hair is covered almost always with a headcloth or a veil, pinned or wrapped so that it falls softly past the shoulders. A habit of modesty and practicality both, since bare hair and open hearths have never mixed especially well. And here is where the room stops looking quite so uniformly brown and grey. Because these people, for all that later centuries like to imagine the early Middle Ages as one long grim smear of mud colour, actually loved colour. And they got it from the fields and hedgerows around them. Woad, a leafy plant fermented down into a rich stubborn blue, madder root. Boiled and simmered into shades of red and warm orange, and weld, a tall yellow-flowered weed that gives cloth a clean sunny gold. Layer those dyes over one another, blue over yellow for green, red over blue for a deep purplish tone, and a skilled dyer in Wessex could produce a whole modest rainbow. So that a wealthy Then's hall on a feast day, hung with woven cloth and full of people in blue and red and saffron yellow, would have looked far brighter and far livelier. Than the black and white manuscript illustrations ever let on, and honestly it is a small crime against history that so many films still dress the 9th century entirely in mud. Look closer still, right at the edges of the firelight, and you will notice the small personal things people carry, a bone or antler comb. Tucked into a belt pouch or hung on a cord, because personal grooming did not stop at the edge of civilization, just because there happened to be a Viking army wandering the countryside. These combs are lovely little objects in their own right, carved with real patience from the shed antler of a red deer or the leg bone of a cow. Sometimes decorated with simple ring and dot patterns, and archaeologists keep pulling them up out of the ground in astonishing numbers, which tells you that whatever else the Anglo-Saxons worried about. Tangled hair was clearly high on the list. Jewellery, where people could afford it, ran to brooches, pins, the occasional bead necklace strung from glass or amber. Nothing showy by the standards of a king's treasury, but plenty, in a farming village, to mark out a family that was doing reasonably well for itself. And it is worth pausing on that brooch again for a moment, because historians still argue over exactly how much clothing style in Wessex varied by region versus by simple household wealth. Whether a particular way of pinning a cloak or wrapping a leg marked you as being from one corner of the kingdom rather than another, or whether it just marked you as someone whose mother happened to be especially skilled with a needle. And the honest truth is that the surviving evidence, mostly a scatter of brooches and combs pulled from graves and rubbish pits, is nowhere near complete enough to settle it either way. What is certain is that clothing here was slow clothing, made by hand from field to shoulder over the course of a whole year, and worn, mended, worn again, and finally cut down for a child or turned into rags for the fire, because nothing in this world of Wessex, from a scrap of wool to a strip of linen, was ever allowed to go to waste, not while there was still one more stitch of use left in it. And beyond the hall, beyond the smell of wood smoke and wet wool, if you let your feet carry you a little further down the muddy track, past the fields and the mill, you will come, sooner or later, to a low stone or timber church, and beyond that, quieter still, to the walls of a monastery. Because this is, above everything else, a thoroughly Christian kingdom, and has been for the better part of 2 centuries now, ever since missionaries first padded their way across these same fields. With their strange new stories and their stranger new alphabet, step inside, softly, mind the threshold, and you will find monks moving through their day in dark, coarse habits, wool again, always wool, belted simply at the waist, and their lives are shaped not by the plough or the harvest, but by something almost as relentless. The daily round of prayer, the offices which come one after another through the day and the night in a rhythm so steady you could set your own drowsy breathing to it. Matins in the small dark hours when the rest of the world is still asleep, Lords as the light comes up grey over the fields. Then prime, terce, sext, none, marking the slow turn of the sun overhead, and vespers and compline easing the day back down into darkness again. And if that sounds exhausting, well, it rather was. And more than one drowsy young novice in these centuries must have found himself nodding off somewhere around the 3rd psalm of Matins. A small sleepy sin that presumably got forgiven rather quickly. In the quieter hours between the offices, some of these monks bend low over a writing desk by candlelight, copying manuscripts letter by careful letter, because every single book in this world exists only because somebody, somewhere, sat and copied it out by hand, 1 page at a time. In ink made from oak galls and iron, onto parchment scraped and stretched from the skin of a calf or a sheep. It is slow, exacting, eye-straining work, done in poor light with a goose-quill pen that needed constant resharpening, and it could take a single monk the better part of a year. To finish copying out one substantial book, which puts a rather different light on anyone today who complains about a long day at the keyboard. These monasteries also keep and treasure relics, a splinter of bone, a scrap of cloth, said to have belonged to some long-departed saint, kept in beautiful little caskets and paraded out on feast days, because in this world the saints are not distant, dusty figures but living presences. Believed to watch over their people, heal the sick, and occasionally, if the stories are to be believed, punish the greedy noblemen who tried to steal monastery land. Which one imagines made for a very persuasive argument in property disputes. but here is the sadder, quieter note running underneath all this candlelit devotion. And it is one that troubled the age deeply. The learning that once flowed so richly through these monastery walls has been decaying for a generation or more. Worn away by war, by plague, by simple neglect, and above all, in these last years, by the Viking raids that have burned more than one monastery library to ash. Along with its books. Latin, the language that once opened every door in the church and in scholarship, has grown rare and shaky even among the clergy themselves. So that a churchman in Wessex now might struggle to read the very psalter in front of him, let alone translate it. And there is a real aching sense among thoughtful people of this era that something precious is slipping quietly out of their hands, while nobody quite manages to catch it. It is, if you want the honest comparison, a little like watching a favourite old recipe get passed down so many times, generation to generation, that eventually nobody left in the family actually remembers how to make it properly, only that it used to be wonderful. This is the exact wound that a certain young king, sharp-eyed, restless, not even on the throne quite yet in the years just before our story, will eventually look at and decide quite stubbornly that he intends to heal. Though that particular chapter of his life is still a little further down the road from where we are standing tonight. It is worth sitting with that decay for a moment longer. Because it was not only books that suffered, but the whole quiet infrastructure that had once made learning possible in the first place. The older generation of scholars who could read Latin fluently. Were dying off one by one without enough younger clergy trained to replace them. Monastery schools that had once turned out capable readers were thinning out or closing altogether. And the raids themselves kept interrupting whatever slow rebuilding might otherwise have happened, since it is difficult to train the next generation of scholars when the monastery library has just gone up. In smoke for the second time in a decade, even the monks who remain faithful to the daily round of offices sometimes recite psalms and prayers from memory now. By long habit, understanding the shape and sound of the Latin far better than its actual meaning, which is its own small. Wistful picture of a tradition running gently down like an unwound clock, still ticking, still keeping the hours, but slower now and further from full understanding with each passing year. Historians still argue over just how deep this decline in learning really went, whether Latin literacy had truly collapsed as badly across Wessex as the laments of the period suggest, or whether the churchmen of the day were exaggerating for effect. But even allowing for a little exaggeration, the pattern holds up well enough in the evidence. Fewer manuscripts being copied, fewer scholars able to read what survived, and monastery after monastery struggling simply to keep its doors standing against raiders who had no particular reverence for relics or libraries either one. And yet even now, even in the middle of all this quiet worry, the candles keep being lit, the bells keep being rung. And the monks keep filing in, half asleep for one more office in the dark, keeping a small, stubborn flame of learning and prayer alive through a difficult century. One copied page and one whispered psalm at a time, waiting, as it happens, for someone to come along and fan that flame back into something brighter. Now leave the hush of the cloister behind you, follow the track that widens as it goes, and let it carry you down toward the water. Because Wessex is not only fields and prayer, it has a beating commercial heart as well, and you will find it at Hamwick, a busy, noisy, wonderfully smelly little trading town hugging the banks of the River Itchen, where it will one day become the city of Southampton. Hamwick is laid out on something close to a grid. Streets running in orderly lines, which on its own tells you this was a planned settlement rather than a village that simply grew wherever the mud allowed. And up and down those streets are the workshops of craft workers turning raw material into finished goods almost as fast as it arrives off the boats. Bone and antler carved into combs and pins, metal hammered and cast into brooches and buckles, leather cut and stitched into shoes and belts, cloth woven and dyed. The whole town humming with the small, steady clatter of people making things with their hands. Walk the market itself, and the noise rises another notch, traders calling out prices. Animals penned and grumbling nearby, the smell of fish and wood smoke and wet rope all tangled together, and here, unlike out in the farming villages where a sack of grain might still be traded straight for a length of cloth, you will actually see coins changing hands, small silver pennies pressed one at a time between two engraved dies. Each one stamped not just with the king's name, but with the name of the individual moneyer who struck it, a signature of sorts, which meant that if a coin turned out underweight or badly made, the authorities knew exactly whose door to knock on, an arrangement that must have kept more than one moneyer awake at night double-checking his scales. Wander a little further along the waterfront and you will see the boats being unloaded, and what comes off them tells its own quiet story about how far this small corner of England actually reaches out into the wider world, because Hamwick trades with the Rhineland and with Francia across the sea, bringing in wine in tall pottery jars for anyone wealthy enough to afford a taste that never came from an English orchard or hive, along with fine imported pottery far smoother and better fired than most of what is thrown on a local wheel, and, in a detail that always surprises people because it sounds so unglamorous, quernstones, the heavy stone discs used for grinding grain by hand, shipped all the way from the volcanic regions of the Rhineland because the local English stone simply does not grind flour as well. Which means that the humble loaf of bread on your table back at the farmstead may well have started its journey as volcanic rock quarried on the other side of the sea. A supply chain longer and stranger than almost anyone eating that bread ever stops to consider. It is a strange thought, standing here in the noise of the market, that a kingdom under such serious threat from raiders across that very same sea is, at the exact same time, still trading busily with the continent, buying its wine and its millstones as though the ships bringing goods and the ships bringing danger were not travelling more or less the same waters, which they very much were. Wander the workshops a little longer, and you begin to notice how specialised this small waterfront town really is, each street given over to its own particular craft, so that you might pass a whole row of leather workers cutting shoes and belts before turning a corner into a row of comb makers with heaps of sawn antler at their feet. And it is easy, watching all this ordered bustle, to forget that most of Wessex has never seen anything quite like it, that Hamwick is very much the exception rather than the rule. Out beyond the town gates, back in the ordinary villages and farmsteads where most people in Wessex actually live, coins like these are still something of a rarity, a town thing. And the older rhythm of barter carries most of daily life along instead. A basket of eggs for a length of cloth, a day's labour repaid in cheese or ale. Favours and goods passed back and forth along lines of obligation that everyone in a small community keeps carefully, if silently, tallied in their heads. Because in a world without banks, the ledger simply lives in memory and reputation instead. Fairs and local markets bring a bit of coin-based trade even out here now and then. Especially around a feast day when people gather anyway. But for the most part, silver pennies are a thing you handle in town, admire, spend quickly, and rarely hoard for long. Unless, of course, you happen to be the sort of cautious soul who buries a little pot of them in the ground for safekeeping, a habit so common in these unsettled decades that archaeologists many centuries later would spend a great deal of time turning up exactly such pots, buried by owners who, for one reason or another, never came back to dig them up. Again, historians still argue over just how much of Wessex's ordinary economy ran on coin versus barter in a year like 878. Whether Hamwick and its royal mint represent a kingdom already thoroughly monetised, or whether that silver was really only skimming the surface of a much older, much more informal economy underneath. And the truth probably sits somewhere in the comfortable, unglamorous middle. Coin for the town and the tax collector, barter and goodwill for the village and the neighbour. Either way, standing here at the edge of the Hamwick waterfront with the smell of tar and fish in the air, and a Rhenish wine jar being carried past your shoulder, you get a rare, clear glimpse of just how connected this small, embattled kingdom still is to a much wider world, trading, minting, grinding its bread on foreign stone. Right up until the moment, not so very far off now, when that wider world comes sailing up the coast with rather less friendly intentions. And it is that darker traffic across the sea that you cannot, in all honesty, keep drifting past forever tonight, because no telling of Wessex in 878 would be complete or even truthful. Without turning to face the Northmen, the Danes, the people this whole anxious year revolves around. They come from across the North Sea, from Denmark and the Scandinavian lands. Farmers and traders themselves, back home for the most part, but drawn out onto the water by a combination of things historians have puzzled over for a long time. Pressure on land back home, the lure of plunder in richer, softer kingdoms to the west, political upheavals pushing ambitious men to seek their fortune elsewhere, and, quite simply, the fact that they had, in their longships, one of the most effective pieces of technology in the whole of early medieval Europe. And if you build the best boat on the continent, it would frankly be strange not to go somewhere in it. These longships are marvels worth pausing on for a moment, even amid the danger, clinker built from overlapping oak planks so that the hull flexes gently with the waves instead of fighting them, shallow enough in the draught to slide up a river that would ground. Almost anything else afloat, rigged with a single broad woolen sail, often handsomely striped, backed up by long banks of oars when the wind failed. And it is exactly that shallow draught and that combination of sail and oar that let the Danes do the one thing that terrified every kingdom on this coast: appear seemingly from nowhere. Dozens of miles inland along a river nobody thought a raiding fleet could reach. This is not some sudden new arrival either. The pressure has been building for well over a decade now. In 865, what the chroniclers call the Great Heathen Army, the Michael here, landed in East Anglia, and unlike earlier raiding parties that grabbed what they could and sailed home again, this one stayed, wintering over, gathering strength, and turning its attention northward the following year to York, which fell to them and became in effect a Viking foothold in the heart of what had been Northumbria. East Anglia's own turn came in 869, when its king, Edmund, was killed by the Danish forces in circumstances that later storytellers dressed up with a good deal of grim, saintly detail, though the plain historical fact underneath it is simple and sobering enough. On its own, a Christian king of an English kingdom was dead, and East Anglia lay open. Mercia went the same unhappy way in 874, its king burghered driven out entirely. Forced across the sea to end his days in Rome rather than on his own throne, which is a rather deflating way for any king's story to end. Retiring not to a quiet estate but to permanent exile in someone else's capital city, and by the time you reach 877, Wessex is, quite starkly, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing on the whole island, which is not a comforting thought to carry with you on an evening walk, but there it is. What makes this army so persistently dangerous, beyond the ships and the shock of sudden arrival, is that these are not hit-and-run raiders in the old style anymore, but an army that settles. In for the winter, building fortified camps, a defended perimeter, sometimes reinforcing a river bend or an old earthwork, where they can shelter, feed themselves off the surrounding countryside, and wait out the cold months before campaigning again come spring, which means that for the kingdoms facing them, there is no safe season anymore. No quiet stretch of winter to rebuild and regroup, only a slightly less active version of the same relentless pressure. They fight mostly on foot once battle is actually joined. Spear and axe and the shield wall much like their English opponents, but they use captured or seized horses constantly to move fast overland between one target and the next. Which lets a force that might take weeks to march cover the same ground in days, appearing to strike a place that thought itself safely out of reach. And vanishing again before any real defence can be organised, a hit-and-run rhythm at the scale of a whole kingdom rather than a single village. It is worth saying plainly and gently that this was real violence against real people, homes burned, church treasures stolen, lives lost or upended entirely, and no amount of dry historical narration should smooth that part away, even while we keep the details themselves suitably soft for a bedtime telling. There is a particular chilling detail the chroniclers preserve about that camp-building habit, which is that the Danes often chose old Roman fortifications or river bends that English engineers had abandoned centuries earlier, so that this invading army was, in a strange roundabout way, sheltering inside the ruins of an even older empire, reusing defences the Romans had built and the English had long since let go to seed. Local communities near these camps learned to read the signs of a coming raid the way farmers elsewhere learn to read weather, watching the rivers, watching the horizon, and moving their stores of grain and their livestock at the first hint of trouble, because a warning given even half a day early could mean the difference between a hard winter. And no winter survived at all. Historians still argue over exactly what drove so many young Scandinavian men to leave their farms and take to the sea in these particular decades. Some point to overcrowded land and squabbling petty kings back home, others to the simple, magnetic pull of a kingdom like Wessex that looked, from across the water, rich, disorganised, and very much worth the risk. And the truth is probably some restless, unglamorous mixture of both, ambition and necessity rowing the same boat. What is not in dispute is the plain shape of the last 13 years, kingdom after kingdom falling, one crown after another either killed, exiled, or bent into submission, until only Wessex remained standing, its young king watching the horizon rather more carefully than any of his predecessors ever needed to, and its people going about their ploughing and their spinning and their evening prayers with one ear, always tuned toward the coast and the rivers, listening for oars. And that young king, the one standing at the centre of all this worry, deserves your full, unhurried attention now, because everything you have wandered through tonight, the wool and the woad dye, the monks bent over their candlelit pages, the silver pennies stamped at Hamwick, the longships sliding up quiet rivers, all of it is about to be tested against one man's stubbornness, and his name, as you already know, is Alfred. He was born around the year 849. Most likely at the royal estate of Wantage in Berkshire, the youngest of several sons born to King Ethelwulf of Wessex, which in the ordinary run of things should have made him, frankly, the least important person in this whole story, a spare among spares, unlikely ever to sit on the throne at all since he had 3 older brothers, Ethelbald, Ethelbert, and Ethelred. Standing in line ahead of him, each with a perfectly good claim of his own, as a small boy Alfred was sent on the long dusty journey all the way to Rome. Where the Pope himself received him, an extraordinary trip for a child of his age in any century, and one imagines the young Alfred coming home afterward with exactly the sort of insufferable travel stories every family has to endure from the relative who has actually seen the world. Though in fairness to him, at that age, Rome must have felt less like a museum and more like an overwhelming fever dream of marble and heat and strange new smells. For years afterward, Alfred simply grows up in the long shadow of his brothers, one king following another onto the throne of Wessex as each in turn dies. Which was, sadly, not an unusual pattern for the age, when illness and warfare together kept the royal succession moving along more quickly than anyone would have wished. And nobody watching the young Alfred through his boyhood and early manhood would have had much reason to guess that the crown was quietly working its way down toward him. He seems, from what little the sources tell us of those early years, to have been a restless, curious child, fond of the old English poems recited around the hall fire and, if the stories can be trusted at all, quicker to memorise them than his older brothers ever were, a small early flicker of the bookish king he would eventually become. Tucked in among all the usual business of growing up in a warrior household. Then comes 871, remembered ever since, not without reason, as the year of battles. A single brutal year in which the West Saxons and the Danish army collided again and again, at Reading, at Basing, at Merton, at Wilton. As many as 9 engagements by some countings, a punishing, exhausting rhythm of marching and fighting that would have worn down far older and steadier men than the ones living through it. Somewhere in the middle of that grim year came Ashdown, and Ashdown, almost alone among the battles of that terrible season, actually went the West Saxons' way. A real and needed victory in which Alfred himself, then still simply the king's brother and second in command, is said to have charged the Danish line like a wild boar. Which is one of those small, vivid details from the old chronicles that makes a 9th century battlefield feel, suddenly, uncomfortably close and real. And then, before that same exhausting year was even finished, King Ethelred died, worn down by the fighting, and the throne of Wessex passed not to a son of his own, but to his last remaining brother. And so Alfred became king in 871 at not yet 25 years old, inheriting a crown he was never supposed to need, in the middle of what was already the hardest fighting Wessex had seen in living memory, which is rather like being handed the keys to a house at the exact moment it has caught fire. By the time you reach the year this whole story is really circling, 878, Alfred is no green, untested young ruler blinking in surprise at his own throne. He has already spent the better part of a decade fighting the Danes, negotiating uneasy truces that never quite hold, watching one neighbouring kingdom after another fall while his own somehow, narrowly, keeps standing, and there is a particular kind of tiredness that settles into a person who has done this much fighting this young. A weariness that has nothing to do with age and everything to do with how many times a man has had to watch his own soldiers die to buy his kingdom another season. He is, by every account that survives of him, thoughtful in a way that seems almost out of place on a 9th century battlefield. Troubled by the state of learning in his kingdom even while he is busy trying to keep that kingdom from being wiped off the map entirely. A king who reads and worries and plans even as he fights, which is not, if you think about it, the most restful combination of qualities for a man to carry. Into midwinter of 878, when the Danes are about to remind him very abruptly just how precarious all of this still is. Historians still argue over how much of the young Alfred's character we can really trust from the sources describing him, since so much of what survives comes from Asser's biography, written well after the fact, by a writer who plainly admired his king, and was not exactly working to a strict standard of dispassionate journalism. So that the pious, learned, slightly melancholy Alfred we think we know may be somewhat flattered in the telling, even if the bones of the story, the boyhood journey to Rome, the year of battles, the victory at Ashdown, the crown nobody expected him to wear, hold up well enough under everything else we know. What is beyond argument is simpler and in its way more moving. Here is a young man, not yet 30, already tired in the way only war can tire a person. Sitting at the head of the very last independent English kingdom, with a midwinter feast approaching and a peace with the Danes that everyone half suspects will not hold. And no way yet of knowing that the hardest test of his whole life is only weeks away, waiting for him in the quiet dark just after 12th night. And so the year turns, soft and cold, toward the worst midwinter Wessex has known, and you should settle in now, because this is the part of the story where the fire seems to go out. It is just after 12th night, that quiet hinge between Christmas feasting and the ordinary grind of January, when the halls still smell faintly of wood smoke and spilled mead, and everyone is a little too full and a little too sleepy to be watchful. King Alfred is keeping the Christmas season at his royal villa of Chippenham, a place meant for celebration, not defence, the kind of manor with long tables and warm hangings. Rather than earthworks and watchmen on the walls, and it is precisely that unwatchfulness the Danish leader Guthrum is counting on, because in the deep dark of a January night, while most of Wessex is still digesting goose and pudding, his army comes down on Chippenham like something out of a bad dream that turns out to be real. You can imagine the shouting that must have torn through the smoke-filled dark, the scramble for weapons that were, inconveniently, not to hand. The sudden understanding that the safest place in the kingdom had just become the most dangerous. It is, historians agree, one of the great gut-punch moments of English history. And it did not stay contained to one manor house. Within days the shock spreads outward like ripples in a disturbed pond. And Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing, the final holdout after Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia, had each in turn buckled under the weight of the Great Heathen Army. Begins quite simply to come apart. You would be forgiven for thinking a kingdom is a solid thing, walls and crowns and legal codes. But in the 9th century, a kingdom is really just an agreement between people to keep believing in it, and that winter the agreement phrased badly. Some of the great men of Wessex, the ealdormen and thegns who had sworn their loyalty over cups of mead and firm handshakes, take one look at the Danish army settling into the heart of their land and decide that discretion, on this particular occasion, is very much the better part of valour. They submit. It is not glamorous, and it is not the stuff songs are made of, but you can hardly blame a man for weighing his family's safety. Against a battle he suspects is already lost, and history, to its credit, tends to be a little gentler about this than the poets are. Others do not even stay to negotiate. They gather what they can carry, herd their households toward the coast, and take ship for Francia or wherever the wind of rumour says a fellow Christian lord might still hold land worth having. Wessex, in the space of a few cold weeks, goes from a kingdom to a rumour of a kingdom. And you have to sit with that for a moment, because it is the kind of collapse that does not usually get undone. Most kingdoms that fall this hard simply stay fallen. But Alfred does not submit, and Alfred does not sail away, which is, historically speaking, rather inconvenient of him. Because it means the story keeps going instead of ending tidily on page 1. Instead, with what the sources describe only as a small force, no grand army, no glittering retinue, just a handful of loyal men whose names history barely bothered to keep, Alfred slips out of the collapsing kingdom and heads for the one kind of country that a Viking warband, superb as it is at open battle and riverborne raiding, is genuinely bad at: the wet, tangled, reed-choked wilderness of the Somerset marshes. It is a strange image to sit with, a king of England reduced to picking his way through bog and thicket with a company small enough to fit comfortably in one modest hall, trading the trappings of royalty for mud on his boots. And the constant low hum of not knowing whether tomorrow brings safety or a spear. You might say it was the worst camping trip in English history. except camping trips generally end with somebody going home, and Alfred, for a good long while, has no home left to go to. Here is the one solid fact worth tucking under your pillow tonight. By that winter, Wessex genuinely was the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing. The final one of 4, after Northumbria, East Anglia and Mercia, had each in turn been broken or driven out by the Great Heathen Army over the previous dozen years. Which means the small, cold, unglamorous business of Alfred surviving in a marsh was not a side story, but the entire remaining hinge on which an independent English-speaking kingdom still turned. And here is a smaller, quirkier thing to carry with you into sleep. Those nobles who chose the ships over submission were not sailing into the unknown. So much as walking a well-worn path, since the Frankish court across the Channel had a long habit of sheltering exiled English royalty and nobility, a sort of 9th century safe house for aristocrats whose kingdoms had temporarily misplaced themselves. Historians still argue whether Alfred's flight into Somerset was a coolly calculated retreat, already half planned before Chippenham ever fell, or a desperate improvisation born purely of a very bad night, and honestly the sources are too thin. And too flattering to Alfred to settle it either way. Try for a moment to picture him on that first hunted night. A king who a week earlier had been distributing Christmas hospitality, now picking a path through reed and mud in the freezing dark. Listening for hoofbeats that never quite stop sounding like they might be following him, because nothing quite humbles royalty like realizing your kingdom now consists of whatever hillock you happen to be standing on. It is worth noting gently that the greatest king in early English history spent part of this winter essentially homeless, sleeping wherever the marsh allowed it, and spare a thought for the loyal handful who went with him. Trudging through freezing marsh water for a cause that looked, by any sensible measure that January, like a very poor bet indeed. Close your eyes now and hold the picture. A small, tired company moving quietly through the reeds of Somerset, carrying nothing more than a stubborn refusal to accept the story was already over. While behind them, in the halls they had abandoned, the fires of other men's Twelfth Night celebrations still faintly burned down to embers. So follow him now, quietly, into the marshes, because this is where the story slows right down and asks you to breathe with it. The Somerset levels in the year 878 are nothing like the tidy green fields a modern map might show you. They're a vast, half-drowned country of open water and reed bed. Of aldercar and willow scrub, a land that floods with the seasons and never quite decides whether it wants to be earth or water. And honestly, after the year Alfred has had, that indecisiveness must have felt like a fairly reasonable way to exist. Winter rains swell the rivers, Tone and Parrot, until the low ground vanishes under a silver sheet, leaving only the higher hummocks, the eyes, as the old tongue calls them, standing up out of the flood like the backs of sleeping animals, and it is onto one of these hidden islands, reachable only by paths that shift and vanish with the water level. Known only to those who already live among the reeds, that Alfred and his small band make their way. Its name is Athelney, and it means, quite beautifully, the Isle of the Princes. Or the Isle of the Nobles, which is either an old name that happened to fit with uncanny precision, or a name that got a very convenient upgrade. Once a king actually turned up there, and you're welcome to decide for yourself how much you trust that coincidence. life on Athelney that winter and into spring is not comfortable. And nobody watching this should imagine otherwise. It is the kind of hard, cold, close-to-the-earth living that would have tested men used to the comforts of a Then's hall. All smoke and mead and woven hangings, but the marsh, unglamorous as it is generous in its own quiet way. The rivers and pools are thick with eels. That slippery, endlessly useful staple of wetland England, caught in woven traps set into the current and smoked or salted for keeping. The reed beds and open meres are loud, especially at dusk, with wildfowl, duck and goose and the wading birds that haunt shallow water, providing meat and eggs to men who could no longer count on a manor's stores. Add to that whatever fish could be taken, whatever small game the alder thickets offered. And you begin to understand that Athelney was not simply a hiding place, but something closer to a larder, a wild pantry, that let a fugitive king and his followers survive a season that should, by all sensible reckoning, have finished them. The marsh people themselves, the local fishermen and fowlers who knew every hidden channel and every solid patch of ground among the reeds, must have been essential in all this. Guiding boats along paths a stranger would drown attempting, and it is worth pausing to notice that the survival of the West Saxon monarchy may have depended, in some unrecorded way, on people whose names never made it into a single chronicle. And now, because no bedtime telling of this story would be complete without it, we come to the cakes, or rather the loaves, since a cake in this telling is simply a small round of bread baked at the hearth. Not the sort of thing you would put a candle in. The tale, which has been warming English hearts and English classrooms for a very long time, goes like this. Hiding out among the marsh folk, disguised or at least unrecognised, Alfred takes shelter for a time in the cottage of a peasant woman, a swineherd's wife, in the fuller versions, who, not knowing she has a king by her fire, asks him to keep an eye on some loaves baking on the hearthstone, while she busies herself elsewhere. Alfred understandably has rather a lot on his mind, a lost kingdom, a scattered nobility, an occupying army camped where his own hall used to stand, and he lets the loaves burn. The woman comes back, sees the ruin of her baking, and gives the stranger by her fire a truly magnificent scolding, entirely unaware that she is berating the King of Wessex for being a poor substitute for an oven-minder. It is a wonderful image. A king humbled not by an army, but by an unimpressed housewife and some overdone bread. And it has been told and retold precisely because it makes a legendary figure feel, for one warm domestic moment, entirely human. But, and this is worth saying gently, the way you might correct a favourite bedtime tale without spoiling it, the story does not appear in Asser's near-contemporary life of King Alfred. Or in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it surfaces only later in the life of St. Neot, written a good century or more after the events it describes. So it comes to us as legend rather than eyewitness fact, a lovely story that may be true in spirit even if it never happened exactly this way. Or may simply be the kind of tale later writers love to attach to a king who had already become, in memory, larger than life. Here is your one solid fact to hold on to. Athelney was a real, physically defensible refuge, a genuinely hidden island amid treacherous marsh, of the sort that gave a small band of loyal men a fighting chance against an army that vastly outnumbered them and its geography. Not any magic is what kept Alfred alive that winter, and here is your quirky tidbit, small and strange and worth smiling at. Centuries later, in 1693, a labourer digging in the ground near Athelney turned up a small, exquisite object of gold and rock crystal and glowing enamel. Inscribed around its edge with the words, "Alfred ordered me to be made," the Alfred jewel, as it is known today most likely. The handle of a pointer used for following text while reading, a small luxury for a king who, in this very marsh, had once had nothing at all. Historians still argue whether the burnt cake story preserves some genuine folk memory of Alfred's time in hiding, passed down by word of mouth until a monk finally wrote it down, or whether it is pure later invention, a charming fiction stitched onto history because every great king, apparently, needs at least one story where he burns the bread. Either way, as you drift off tonight, let yourself sit with the image of a king alone by a stranger's hearth, staring into the flames. With a kingdom's worth of trouble on his mind, entirely failing at the one small ordinary task set in front of him. As the year eases toward Easter, something in the marsh begins to change, slowly, the way frost eases out of the ground when nobody's quite watching it happen. Around Easter of 878, Alfred and his followers stop merely surviving among the reeds of Athelney and start building, raising a proper fort on that hidden island. Not a great stone thing. Nothing like the towns you may picture from later centuries, but a defensible earth and timber stronghold, ditched and banked, tucked behind causeways that only the marsh people and Alfred's own men know how to cross safely. You might think of it as the world's most inconvenient fortress, reachable only by paths that could vanish under a rising river within hours, but that inconvenience is precisely the point. Because an army that cannot find its way across a bog cannot besiege what it cannot even locate. It is a small, damp, unglamorous headquarters for what remains of a kingdom. And yet it is real, it is defended, and this is the important part. It is a base rather than merely a hiding place, which changes everything about what happens next. Because a king hiding is one story, but a king with a fort is quite another, and from Athelney, Alfred and his band begin doing something the Danes had perhaps stopped expecting from. Wessex altogether, they start fighting back. Not in the great, clashing shield wall style of a pitched battle. Alfred has nowhere near the men for that yet, but in smaller, sharper, more irritating ways, slipping out of the marshes to raid Danish positions and supply lines, and then melting back into the reeds before any real pursuit can be organised. You could call it guerrilla warfare, though nobody in 9th century Wessex would have used that word, and there is something almost comic, in a very dry way, about picturing the Danes, who had, after all, conquered 3 other English kingdoms with terrifying efficiency, being harassed by a man they had every reason to believe was already finished. Popping up out of a swamp to cause trouble, and then vanishing again like the world's most persistent mosquito. It must have been exhausting for them in a way that no amount of armour could really solve, because you cannot fully guard against an enemy who knows the ground better than you do, and who has, frankly, nothing left to lose. These raids were not simply about wounded pride or keeping busy through a long spring. They served a genuinely practical purpose, because a fort full of men still needs to eat, and Athelney, However generous its eels and wildfowl could not feed an army indefinitely on marsh fare alone. So the raiding parties that slipped out from the island were doing double duty. Harrying the enemy while also gathering what supplies could be taken or traded, keeping Alfred's small company fed and armed through weeks that might otherwise have starved them into surrender without a single. Danish spear being raised. It is worth pausing here to notice how unglamorous the actual mechanics of resistance often are, not speeches and banners, but the quiet, grinding logistics of keeping a few dozen tired, damp men supplied with bread and meat, while the rest of the world assumes you're all ready. Beaten, which is rather less inspiring to paint on a tapestry, but was, in the end, entirely necessary to everything that followed. And alongside the raiding, something else was moving through the shires of Wessex that spring. Something quieter than an army, but in the end perhaps more important. Word. Carefully. And presumably with no small amount of risk to the men carrying it, news went out from Athelney into the wider countryside that the king was not dead, was not in exile. Was not kneeling before Guthrum in submission, but was alive, armed, and, however improbably, gathering his strength in the marshes of Somerset. You have to imagine what that news must have meant to households who had spent the winter believing Wessex simply did not exist anymore in any organised sense. Who had watched neighbours submit or flee, and assumed the old order was finished for good. A rumour like that passed quietly from hall to hall, farmstead to farmstead, church to church. Is the kind of thing that can put a spine back into a kingdom that had every reason to have given up. It travelled, presumably, along the same muddy tracks and river crossings that carried every other piece of news in this world, whispered by traders and travellers and men who had good reason. Not to say too much too loudly, and it worked, because when Alfred did eventually call his people to him, they came. Here is the one solid historical fact worth settling into as you drift. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Asser's Life of King Alfred both record this Athelney period as the true turning point of the entire 878 crisis, the moment when a fugitive with a handful of men became once again a king actively directing a campaign, which means the Marsh fort, however humble, deserves just as much credit for saving Wessex as anything that happened afterward on an open battlefield. And here is your quirky tidbit for tonight. Archaeologists and historians have never located the precise remains of Alfred's Athelney fort with total certainty. So what you're picturing right now, the ditches, the timber palisade, the muddy causeway, is necessarily part educated reconstruction. Built from a handful of clues and a great deal of careful, patient guesswork, rather than a floor plan anyone could hand you. Historians still argue whether Alfred's raids from Athelney were a genuinely significant military threat to Guthrum's forces, or mostly a symbolic, morale-sustaining exercise that mattered more for what it told frightened Wessex households than for what it actually cost the Danes in men or supplies, and the honestly rather thin sources from the period leave plenty of room for either reading. Picture it now, one last time before you let the scene go, smoke curling faintly from a fire hidden well back from the causeway, so as not to give the position away. A handful of tired men mending gear by firelight, and somewhere out beyond the reeds a rider setting off in the dark with nothing but a message worth risking his neck for. The king lives. It is, when you sit with it, a strange kind of turning point, not a trumpet blast or a coronation, just quiet. men doing quiet, dangerous, unglamorous work in a swamp, and yet here you are tonight, many centuries later, still telling the story. Let your mind drift now away from the marsh and out onto the roads, because Wessex, even in a year of crisis, still has to move. Messengers, traders, priests. Farmers driving stock to market, all of them threading their way across a landscape crossed by two very different kinds of path. And the contrast between them tells you almost everything about how this world actually worked. First, there are the old Roman roads, laid down centuries before by an empire that had, by 878, been gone from Britain for close to 500 years, and yet its roads are still there, still startlingly straight, still paved or metalled in a way that nothing built since could match. Cutting across the countryside with a sort of confident indifference to hills and rivers that only an empire with unlimited slave labour could really afford. Travelling one of these old roads must have felt faintly eerie even at the time, a stretch of engineering so far beyond what 9th century Wessex could produce that ordinary people walking it might. Will have wondered whether their own great-great-grandparents had anything to do with building it at all, since it was already ancient when their kingdom was born. But you cannot always be on a Roman road, because Roman roads go where Romans wanted to go, mostly between old fortresses and old towns, and Wessex life happens everywhere in between. At the mill, the moot site, the little church, the cousin's farm 3 valleys over, and so between these grand straight roads runs a much humbler network of local tracks. Worn by cartwheels and hooves and centuries of feet, muddy in winter, dusty and rutted in summer, following the contours of hills and hedgerows rather than any straight line at all. These are the roads most people actually use, and they are, frankly, a bit of a trial. A cart axle deep in mud after autumn rain. A track that was passable last month and now simply is not. A route that adds a half day to any journey because the direct way runs straight through somebody's flooded pasture. Rivers complicate things further, and unless you are near one of the few proper bridges, themselves often relics of Roman engineering patched by later hands, you are looking at a ford. A shallow crossing where the water is low and the bottom firm enough to risk a cart or pack animals, assuming the river has not swollen with recent rain into something considerably less. Forgiving than it looked from the near bank. None of this travel, it must be said, was especially safe, and anyone setting out on the roads of Wessex in 878 did so with a reasonable awareness that the journey might contain more than mud and inconvenience. There were, of course, the Danes themselves this particular year. A very immediate hazard for anyone travelling near territory they controlled or raided, but even in calmer years the roads carried their share of ordinary danger. Robbers who knew the lonely stretches. Injury or illness far from any help, weather turning bad on open ground with no shelter in sight. A wise traveller did not set out alone if it could be helped. Preferred to move in company, and tried to time a journey to reach some known roof by nightfall rather than trust to luck on an empty road after dark. Because darkness on an unfamiliar track in the 9th century was not a minor inconvenience but a genuine hazard, the kind that made the difference between a good story to tell later and no story at all. And yet, for all these dangers, the roads of Wessex were alive with people, wayfarers on foot with a bundle over one shoulder, pedlars with packs of small goods, needles and ribbons and little iron tools, moving between farms and hamlets that never saw a proper market. Monks travelling between religious houses on business that was probably more mundane than holy, and the occasional royal messenger pushing hard along the old straight roads with news that could not wait. What made all this movement possible, what kept a peddler or a lone traveller from simply starving or freezing between one settlement and the next? Was a deeply ingrained custom of hospitality that ran through the whole of Anglo-Saxon society, an unspoken but very real expectation that a traveller who knocked at a farmstead door as evening came on would be given at minimum a place by the fire and a bowl of pottage, whatever thin or thick version of that everyday stew happened to be simmering that night. It was not charity exactly, or not only charity, it was closer to a kind of social insurance, the working assumption that today's host might well be tomorrow's guest. And a household that turned away a stranger on a cold night earned itself a reputation that could travel considerably faster than any cart. Here is the one solid fact to carry with you. Those Roman roads were not a minor curiosity, but the actual arteries of 9th century. England, still used for major royal and military movement, including, as history would soon show, the muster of the West Saxon Fyrd, nearly 5 centuries after the empire that built them had packed up and left, which tells you something rather humbling about how much easier it is to lay good stone than to keeps. Good order. And here, small and strange, is your quirky tidbit. Many of these ancient roads had by this time picked up entirely new, thoroughly un-Roman names from the Anglo-Saxons who used them. So that a road built by legionaries marching under eagle standards might now be known to local farmers simply as the Hare Path, the Army Road or War Path. A very practical rebranding by a people who cared considerably less about who built a thing than about what it was currently useful for. Historians still argue whether the sheer survival and continued use of the Roman road network across Anglo-Saxon England reflects careful ongoing maintenance by later kings and communities, or whether these roads simply refused to wear out on their own, built so solidly in the first place that centuries of neglect could barely dent them, and the honest truth. As usual with buried Roman engineering, remains difficult to settle either way. So let the image settle now, slow and warm as the fire a tired traveller finally reaches. A straight pale road running off into the dusk, a figure trudging along it with a pack on his back and no particular hurry left in his step. And somewhere ahead, glowing faintly through the dark, a farmstead door about to open onto warmth, noise, a full bowl, and a floor to sleep. On, because that, more than any law or any king, was the thread that held the whole travelling world of Wessex together. Let your thoughts settle now onto something quieter than roads and marshes, something you might not expect to find soothing at all, and yet somehow does have its own slow, orderly comfort to it. The way justice actually worked in Alfred's Wessex back before courts looked anything like the ones you might picture today. There were no professional judges, no benches of magistrates, no thick books of precedent gathering dust in some official archive. Instead, there was something both simpler and in its own way more personal. A system built less around punishment handed down from on high, and more around restoring balance between people who had wronged one another. Because a 9th century community that lost too many of its able-bodied men to endless blood feuding was a community that would not survive very long against Danes, bad harvests, or anything else the world cared to throw at it. At the very centre of this system sits a concept that can sound almost shocking to modern ears. Until you understand the sense behind it, the vergild, quite literally the man price, a fixed sum of silver that measured the worth of a person's life should that life be unlawfully taken. A Saul, an ordinary free farmer, carried a vergild of around 200 shillings, while a Then, a noble landholder of higher rank, was valued at roughly 6 times that. Some 1,200 shillings, a difference that tells you plainly how thoroughly rank ran through every corner of this society, right down to the price tag placed on a man's own body. The purpose of the vergild was not to put a cynical value on human life so much as to stop the alternative, which was blood feud. A cycle of retaliatory killing that could drag whole families into endless grinding vengeance. Instead, if a man was killed, his kin could be compensated in silver by the killer's kin. A payment that formally closed the matter and, in theory, ended the violence before it spread further. You might raise an eyebrow at the idea of buying your way out of a killing. And it is fair to note the system worked rather better for men who had silver to spare than for those who did not. But weigh that against whole families wiping each other out generation after generation, and the vergild starts to look less like cynical bookkeeping and rather more like practical social engineering. Beneath and around this stood the sworn oath, which carried a weight in Anglo-Saxon society that is genuinely hard to overstate from where you're sitting now. Wrapped up warm in a world of written contracts and notarized signatures, in a largely oral culture where most people could neither read nor write and a formal document was rare and precious, a person's spoken word, sworn before witnesses, functioned as something close to sacred law. To break a sworn oath was a serious moral and social failure that could cost a man his standing and his credibility, since a community's trust, once broken, was desperately hard to rebuild with no other reliable way of enforcing an agreement. This is precisely why the oaths later sworn by Guthrum and his followers, when peace was made, mattered so enormously to a West Saxon audience raised on the sanctity of sworn word. And why a broken oath in this world lands with a weight that a broken modern promise, made over something as flimsy as a phone call, simply cannot match. Justice itself was administered not by some distant royal court, but by local gatherings, assemblies of free men known as the moot, meeting typically at the level of the 100. That administrative division of the shire gathering out in the open air at some long-agreed meeting place, a particular tree, a ford, a stone, a barrow left over from far older times, where disputes could be heard, oaths sworn, and judgments reached collectively by men who generally already knew one another's families and grievances rather well. There was something almost neighbourly about it, this business of your disputes being settled by people who had known your father and would likely still be dealing with your children. And it meant a reputation for honesty or for troublemaking travelled a very short distance before it caught up with you, which must have been either a great comfort or a considerable inconvenience, depending entirely on how well you had been behaving lately. And presiding over the whole intricate web of moots, oaths, and silver payments was the concept of the king's peace, the idea that the king himself stood as guarantor of order across his realm. so that a serious breach of law was not merely a private matter between two feuding families, but an offence against the peace the king was sworn to keep. This is one reason a king like Alfred, even hunted and reduced to a handful of followers in a marsh, remained so important to Wessex society. He was not simply a warlord who happened to win battles, but the living guarantee that this entire fragile, oath-bound, silver-priced system of order had someone standing behind it. Here is your one solid fact to carry into sleep tonight. These guild figures and legal customs were not vague folk tradition, but were written down in actual law codes issued by. West Saxon kings, a tradition Alfred himself would later add to substantially, gathering and revising the laws of his predecessors into a single code prefaced rather movingly by the Ten Commandments themselves. And here, small and curious, is your quirky tidbit: a thrall, an enslaved person at the very bottom of this legal ladder. Carried no guild at all, which meant that in the cold arithmetic of this system, harming a thrall was treated as damage to another person's property rather than as a crime against the thrall as a person in his own right. An uncomfortable reminder that this orderly, oath-bound world was, for some of the people living inside it, not particularly just at all, whatever comfort the system offered everyone standing above them. Historians still argue whether the Weregild system genuinely succeeded in curbing blood feud violence across Anglo-Saxon England as intended, or whether it mostly gave wealthy families a convenient, silver-plated escape hatch that poorer families could never quite afford, leaving the old cycle of vengeance to carry on regardless further down the social ladder. Where nobody with a law code was paying very close attention. So let that be the thought you drift off on tonight. Not swords and marshes this time, but something quieter and, in its own dry way, almost comforting, a world that took a person's word so seriously that breaking it could ruin you, that gathered neighbours under an old tree to settle grievances face to face, and that measured, however imperfectly, the worth of a human life in hard silver rather than simply letting the killing go on and on. Let your eyes rest a moment, and let your mind wander from the smell of wood smoke and pottage towards something a little sterner. Because a kingdom that wants to keep its pottage bubbling has to be able to defend the pot. So settle in and let's talk very quietly about how a man in Alfred's Wessex went to war, because even that, believe it or not, can be a lullaby if you tell it slowly enough. Picture the third. Not a standing army in the way you might imagine, with barracks and uniforms and a payroll office, but the Shire Levy. A muster of free men called out by the king or his ealdorman when trouble came knocking, which in 878 it certainly had. A ceorl might leave his plough mid-furrow. Kiss whoever needed kissing, and go stand in a field with a spear in his hand and his heart somewhere up around his throat. The thegns, the noble landholders, brought their own retinues. Men bound to them by oaths and gifts and mutual obligation, better armed and better trained, the backbone around which the softer levy could gather. It was not glamorous, it was neighbours, cousins. The miller's son, the man who fixed your cartwheel last spring, all standing shoulder to shoulder because the alternative was worse, and when they stood close. This is the heart of it, the silled wale, the shield wall, round wooden shields rimmed in leather and bossed with iron, overlapping edge to edge like the world's grimmest roof tiles. so that a wall of men became, briefly, one single stubborn creature with 100 heartbeats and one shared intention, which was simply not to move. Behind that wall bristled spears. And the spear, you should know, was the great commoner of Anglo-Saxon warfare, cheap enough for almost anyone to own, long enough to keep an enemy at a polite and permanent distance. Thrust overhand or underhand from the second and third ranks, while the front line held the line with shield and nerve. If weapons had personalities, the spear would be the reliable friend who shows up early and never complains, while the sword would be the friend who shows up late in a flashy cloak. And expects everyone to notice, because the sword was a different matter entirely. Costly, painstakingly forged, sometimes pattern welded so that its blade shimmered with a faint watery ripple where different rods of iron had been twisted and hammered and folded together by a smith who probably deserved better pay than history ever recorded him getting. A sword was a mark of status as much as a tool of killing. It might be named, passed down, wrapped in cloth and spoken of the way. You'd speak of a good horse or a difficult uncle. Not every fighting man carried one. Most made do with the sayax, the long single-edged knife that hung at the belt of almost every free man in Wessex, for reasons that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with cutting bread. Skinning a rabbit or trimming a bit of leather, and which, in a pinch, on a bad afternoon on a Wiltshire hillside, became a weapon too. Close and ugly and personal in a way the history books tend to describe from a very safe, very polite distance, and so shall we. On the other side of that shield wall, because history, annoyingly, always needs another side, came the Danes, and among the sounds that must have carried across the field, few would have been more unsettling than the particular rhythm of the two-handed Danish axe, a weapon that needed both hands and no shield to swing it. Which tells you something about the kind of confidence or recklessness, or simple faith in your own comrades' shields, that its wielder needed to carry into a fight. It was not a subtle weapon, it did not need to be. A single well-placed swing could do the work of several spear thrusts. And its reputation alone likely did some of the fighting before the blade ever did. And then there was armour, worn by those who could afford it and dreamed of. By those who could not, the mail byrnie, a shirt woven link by iron link, thousands of tiny rings riveted together by smiths whose fingers must have ached. In ways we can only guess at, heavy enough that wearing one all day was its own small ordeal, and an iron helm to go with it if you were truly fortunate, rounded. Sometimes with a simple guard for the nose, the closest thing a man had to a promise that he might walk home again. Most fighters, though, made do with padded cloth or boiled leather, or simply their own wool cloak wrapped snug and their own courage wrapped snugger, which historians will tell you gently was rather a lot to ask of wool. Here's a quirky little thought to carry with you. A sword in this world was so valuable that it could function almost like a small, sharp bank account mentioned by name in wills, passed from father to son alongside land and cattle, sometimes given a name of its own the way you might name a boat, or, apparently, a particularly beloved axe. Imagine introducing your sword at a dinner party. Some of them, it seems, very nearly were. Historians still argue whether the third that mustered in a crisis like 878's was truly a broad levy of every free man in a shire, or whether in practice it was really a smaller, better equipped elite of thanes and their household men doing most of the actual fighting, while the wider countryside simply supplied support, food, and the occasional terrified volunteer. The sources are frustratingly thin on exactly who stood in those ranks, and the debate rumbles on in university common rooms to this day. Presumably over much better ale than anyone in 878 ever had. What matters for our purposes, drowsy as you are, is simply this. Weapons a farmer already owned. A spear for the wolves. A knife for the harvest became, almost overnight, the tools that would decide whether Wessex kept its name on the map at all. There is something almost tender in that. If you squinted it right in the moonlight, half asleep, a kingdom defended not by professional killers in matching armour, but by ordinary hands that had, until very recently, been perfectly happy holding a hoe. And so, weapons gathered, wall imagined, let your breathing slow again, because before any of this steel meets any of that steel, we still have water to cross. The strange, shallow, dragon-proud water that brought the Danes to Wessex's shores in the first place, and that is exactly where we drift to next. Follow that thought out across the fields now, past the last farmhouse, past the reeds, until the land gives way to water. Because if you want to understand why Wessex spent so many sleepless years being ambushed from directions nobody expected, you have to understand the ship that made it all possible. A vessel so cleverly built that it turned every river, every tidal creek, every stretch of unguarded beach into a front door the Danes could simply let themselves through. The longship was, in its quiet way, a marvel, built by the method we call clinker construction, which just means the oak planks of its hull overlapped one another. Like the shingles on a roof, each plank riveted to the next with iron nails and made watertight with wool or animal hair soaked in tar. So that the whole hull had a kind of springy, flexible strength to it, able to flex and twist with the waves instead of fighting them. The way a willow branch bends in a wind that would snap an oak. And here is the detail that ought to be more famous than it is. These ships drew astonishingly little water, shallow enough that a fully loaded longship could glide up a river that looked, to anyone standing on the bank, entirely too modest to carry an invasion. A crew could run their vessel right onto a beach, or into the shallows of a river you'd have sworn was only good for herding ducks. Unload, raid, and be gone again before word had even reached the next village, let alone the king. A single square sail did most of the heavy work when the wind cooperated. Often woven of wool and sometimes striped or checked in ways that must have looked, at a distance, almost cheerful for something so thoroughly connected to bad news. And when the wind didn't cooperate, well, that's what the oars and the rowers' aching shoulders were for, a long double row of men pulling in a rhythm that probably had its own quiet grunted song to keep the timing, because rowing in silence for hours on end is the sort of thing that turns even the fiercest warrior faintly philosophical. Some of the grander ships wore carved prows at bow and stern, serpents or dragons rearing up from the timber, painted eyes glaring toward the shore. Partly ornament, Partly, one imagines, a very early and very effective form of psychological warfare, the maritime equivalent of a large dog baring its teeth before it's even said hello. This mobility, more than any single weapon, more than any particular fierceness of temperament, is what made the Great Heathen Army such a persistent, exhausting problem for the kingdoms of England. An army that could vanish onto the water and reappear 50 miles down the coast a few days later was almost impossible to pin down with the slower, land-bound forces a 9th century kingdom. Could muster, you might defeat them soundly on a Tuesday and find, to your considerable irritation, that they had simply rowed off and become someone else's Wednesday problem. Wessex's own coastline, with its long, soft stretches of shingle and its river mouths reaching inland like beckoning fingers, the Parrett, the Frome, the waters around Wareham and Exeter. That had already seen Danish keels in the years just before 878, offered exactly the kind of welcome those ships were built to exploit. It must have felt, to anyone watching from a hilltop, less like facing an army and more like facing the weather. There is a particular slightly comic tragedy in how little defence there was against this for so long. A kingdom of farmers and shepherds, brilliant at building halls and ploughing long straight furrows, simply had no answer, in these early years, to a people who had turned boat building into something close to an art form and a religion at once. It's a bit like showing up to a foot race only to discover your opponent has quietly invented the bicycle, and here, very softly, because we are not meant to rush ahead of ourselves. Tonight is a small seed worth planting for later. Alfred, watching all this unfold, watching his kingdom bruised again and again by ships he could never quite catch, would eventually turn his own mind to the sea. Years still ahead of the story we're telling now, but the thought was surely already there. Somewhere behind his eyes, even in 878, even in the marshes, a king who has been outrun by water more than once tends, eventually, to start thinking about boats of his own. Here's your quirky tidbit to carry off to sleep. Those longships, for all their fearsome reputation, were remarkably light. Light enough, in fact, that a crew could haul a smaller. Vessel bodily out of the water and carry or drag it overland between two rivers if the geography demanded it, sidestepping the need to sail all the way around a headland. Imagine a group of large, heavily armed men essentially portaging their boat like over-enthusiastic campers, grumbling the entire way, and you have a fairly accurate picture. Historians still argue whether the dragon ship, the ornately carved longship of legend, was really the common vessel of a raiding fleet or a rarer, grander flagship reserved for a chieftain who wanted to make an entrance. Most of the ships crossing to England were probably plainer, more workmanlike affairs, built for speed and cargo rather than spectacle. And the popular image of a whole fleet bristling with snarling dragon heads may owe more to later storytelling than to the actual beaches of 9th century Wessex. So let the water settle in your mind now, dark and quiet, oars resting, sail slack, because the tide of this story is about to turn back toward dry land, toward a king who has spent long enough hiding among reeds and eels, and who is at last about to send riders out across the shires with a summons that will bring Wessex back to its feet. And so we arrive, gently, at the moment the whole quiet story has been leaning toward. The moment when a king who has spent long weeks knee-deep in marsh water and wounded pride finally straightens his back, wipes the mud from his boots as best he can, and decides it is time. It is now the 7th week after Easter, which puts us somewhere in early May of the year 878, and Easter itself is not so very far behind Alfred. You'll remember that it was only around that holy season that he'd finished building his hidden fort at Athenry, tucked into the marshes where the rivers Tone and Parrett tangle together into something that isn't quite land and isn't quite water. From that damp, secretive stronghold, Alfred sends his summons out across the shires, riders carrying word to every corner that still had ears willing to listen, and the word is this: come. Come now, come armed, come ready, come to a place called Ecgbritistan, Egbert's stone. We do not know, and this is worth savouring rather than mourning, exactly where that stone stood. Historians have made their guesses over the years, pointing toward the wooded high ground near Penselwood, on the border where Somerset, Wiltshire and Dorset all lean companionably against one another. Or perhaps somewhere closer to Kingston Deverill, and the truth is nobody living today can walk up and put a hand on the actual rock and say with certainty, this. This is where it happened. It has vanished the way so many boundary markers of that age vanished, worn away or hauled off for some farmer's wall, leaving only its name behind in an old chronicle, which feels somehow exactly right for a story this quiet and this human. A monument to a turning point in English history that nobody bothered to keep signposted, presumably because nobody at the time thought they were living through the sort of thing that would need a plaque. But the men came anyway, stone or no stone, sign or no sign, because word of mouth has always travelled faster than masonry. From Somerset they came, men who had watched their own countryside crawling with Danish patrols for months and had learned, the hard way, how to disappear into hedgerows at the wrong moment. From Wiltshire they came, and from the part of Hampshire that had not, in the chronicler's rather blunt and faintly judgmental phrasing, fled overseas. Because you should know that not everyone had stayed to fight. When Chippenham fell on that bitter night just after Twelfth Night, plenty of frightened. Sensible people had simply packed what they could carry and taken ship for Francia, rather than wait and see how the story ended. Nobody in this telling is going to mock them too hard for that. Fleeing a marauding army is not, historically speaking, a foolish instinct. But those who stayed, who gathered their spears and their nerve and walked or rode toward Egbert's stone through the soft green business of an English May, found something waiting there that must have felt for a moment like waking from a very bad dream. Their king, alive, not captured, not drowned in some forgotten fen, not, as rumour in the darkest weeks must surely have whispered, dead and gone the way his brothers had gone before him, but standing there in the flesh, thinner perhaps, browner from months outdoors, smelling faintly and permanently of marsh mud in a way his laundress would spend weeks trying to fix. And the chronicles, usually so stingy with emotion, so content to record deaths and battles in flat-clipped little sentences, allow themselves an unusual moment of warmth here. The men were glad to see him. Genuinely, simply glad, the way you were glad when a friend you'd quietly given up on walks back through the door. There is something worth sitting with in that gladness. In the dim light, half dozing as you are, this was not a coronation, not a grand procession with banners snapping in orderly rows. It was closer to a reunion of very tired, very frightened people, discovering that the thing they loved most about their kingdom, Not the land exactly, not even the church. But the king himself, the person who was supposed to hold it all together, had not, after all, been lost. A king rising out of a swamp to reclaim his shires is not. Historically speaking, the most dignified image available to a chronicler, and yet here we are, still telling it, over 1,000 years later, precisely because it refuses to be anything other than moving. Here's a small joke to tuck under your pillow. One imagines the reunion at Egbert Stone came with a fair amount of polite throat clearing on all sides. As loyal subjects tried to figure out the correct etiquette for greeting a monarch who had, by all appearances, been living rough with the eels for 2 months. Do you bow? Do you offer him a clean tunic first? History, unhelpfully, does not record the answer, and here's your quirky tidbit, small and strange and worth keeping. The number of men who could gather on short notice across 3 shires in the space of about a week tells you something about how efficient this supposedly rough and ready Anglo-Saxon world actually was. At moving information, no telephones, no printed proclamations, just riders and word of mouth, and still, somehow, enough men found the right hillside on the right day to change the shape of English. History. Historians still argue whether this muster represented anything close to the whole potential fighting strength of those 3 shires, or whether it was really a smaller, hardier corps. The men who had never quite given up hope, self-selected by their own stubbornness, with many others still scattered, hiding or simply waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing. Themselves to a king who had, after all, just spent a season losing rather badly. Whatever their numbers, they were enough, at least for now. To give Alfred something he had not had since that terrible night at Chippenham, an army, however modest, standing behind him in the soft May light. Ready to march, and march they will, very soon, toward a wood with an oak in it, and a long, quiet night. And not far beyond that, a hillside that history would remember by a name almost nobody had heard of before that week, Eddington. Let the men rest a moment where they stand at Egbert Stone, catching their breath, embracing cousins they hadn't expected to see again. And then, softly, let the whole gathered host begin to move, because a king does not summon an army just to admire it standing still in a field. From Egbert Stone, Alfred leads them forward, and the chronicles tell us the next stop on this quiet, purposeful journey is a place called Iley Oak. Iglea, as the old sources render it, likely near Eastleigh Wood outside Warminster, which meant a march of perhaps a day's steady walking across the rolling chalk country of Wiltshire. The kind of gentle green landscape that gives no hint, none at all, of the violence waiting somewhere ahead of it. You can imagine the columns stretched out along the old trackways. Men on foot mostly, a few on horseback, spears resting on shoulders the way a farmer might carry a hoe on his way to a familiar field. Except that this particular field had a Danish army camped somewhere near it, which does tend to change the mood of a walk considerably. They camp for one night near Iley Oak, and this, I think, is where the story asks you to slow all the way down. Because there is nothing especially dramatic about a camp. No clash of arms yet, no shouting, just the ordinary quiet business of an army settling itself for the dark. Fires would have been lit, small ones, careful ones, because nobody wanted to advertise their exact position, to an enemy who was, by all accounts, camped uncomfortably close by. Men would have checked their spear shafts for splinters, run a whetstone along the edge of a sayax out of nervous habit more than necessity. Shared out whatever bread and cheese and thin ale they'd carried from home, and talked, in the low murmuring way soldiers have always talked the night before, something enormous, about entirely ordinary things. A leaking roof back home, a disputed bit of pasture, a sister's upcoming wedding, because the mind, faced with the genuinely unthinkable, will often reach gratefully for the mundane instead. There is something almost tender about imagining Alfred himself somewhere in that camp, a king who only weeks earlier had been reduced to burning a peasant woman's loaves. Because his mind was elsewhere entirely, now sitting among his own gathered thegns on the eve of the fight that would decide whether Wessex survived as an independent kingdom at all. Or joined East Anglia and Mercia and Northumbria in the growing list of places the Danes had simply absorbed. One imagines he slept badly. If he slept at all, though the sources tactfully declined to comment on his insomnia, it's the sort of detail chroniclers rarely bother recording. Perhaps because everyone already assumed it. The way you assume a man about to give a very important speech probably didn't sleep wonderfully the night before either. The Danish camp lay near, close enough that both sides must have known, with the particular quiet certainty of men who have spent months at war. That morning would bring the reckoning that months of raiding and hiding and burning and fleeing had all been building toward. There would have been sentries posted, of course. Peering into the dark toward a wood or a hollow where enemy fires glowed faintly orange, each side no doubt trying to guess the strength of the other from the number. And spacing of those distant flickers, and each side, in all likelihood, guessing wrong in whatever direction suited their nerves best that night. Fear does arithmetic very badly. And yet for all the tension, notice how ordinary the actual mechanics of it were. No grand councils of war lit by torchlight in the way a later. More theatrical age would imagine it. No rousing speeches carved for posterity, just an army of farmers and thegns lying on cold ground under a Wiltshire sky in early May. Waiting. The way people have always waited before the thing that will define the rest of their lives, which is to say restlessly, and a little too aware of every small sound. Here's a gentle joke to keep you company in that dark. Somewhere in that camp, you can be fairly certain, at least one exhausted Then was quietly furious that he'd left his good. Cloak back home, because nothing sharpens a man's regrets on the eve of battle quite like realising he's about to face the entire Danish army while slightly underdressed for the weather. Here's your solid fact to hold on to, the kind you can actually trust. This march from Egbert Stone to Iley Oak and onward, camped for a single night before battle, is recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle itself, one of the few moments in this whole story where we have something close to a contemporary, near first-hand account of Alfred's movements. Rather than legend dressed up as memory, which is precisely why historians treat these few sparse lines with such uncommon reverence, turning them over and over like a handful of very old coins. And here's your quirky tidbit, small and human. An army moving across 9th century Wiltshire wouldn't have marched in neat rows the way you might picture soldiers marching today. But in a looser, more ragged column shaped by whatever cart tracks and drove roads already existed, meaning the front of Alfred's host may will have reached Iley Oak's shade a good while before the stragglers at the back had even left Egbert's stone behind them. Historians still argue whether Alfred's decision to camp one night rather than press on and strike immediately was a calculated piece of generalship. Letting stragglers catch up, letting nerves settle, perhaps even letting word of his approach unsettle the Danish camp a little more, or simply the practical necessity of a tired, half-fed army that could not physically march and fight in the same breath. Either way, morning was coming, soft and grey and entirely unconcerned with how frightened anyone. Lying beneath it happened to feel, and with that morning came at last the day the whole kingdom's fate would turn on. Morning comes the way it always comes, indifferent and grey and soft at the edges, and somewhere on the chalk downland above the little settlement that would one day be called Eddington. Two armies rise from their cold camps and begin, quietly, to become the thing history remembers them as. We don't know exactly how many men stood in each line that day. The sources, frustratingly but perhaps mercifully, keep their arithmetic to themselves, but we do know the shape the fighting took because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us this much. Alfred fought with a dense shield wall, a sildbur, against the entire assembled Danish force, a full, deliberate confrontation on the open downs near what is now the village of Eddington in Wiltshire. On ground that still, if you visit today, has that rolling, exposed quality of land meant for grazing sheep rather than staging the survival of a kingdom. Picture the two walls forming across from one another in that pale early light, shields locked edge to edge, the iron bosses catching what thin sun there was. Spear points bristling forward like a hedge that had decided, for one day only, to take a firm political stance. There would have been noise before there was fighting. There always is, men shouting not so much words as sound itself, the low collective roar armies make to convince themselves and the enemy that they are not, in fact, quietly terrified. And then, at some signal lost entirely to history, the two walls came together and the real work of the day began. I want to tell you about this gently, because that is the promise of this whole quiet journey we've been on together. And because the mechanics of 9th century battle are not, frankly, anything you need vivid pictures of before sleep, think of it less as a clash, and more as an enormous, exhausting hours-long shoving match, two crowds of men leaning their whole weight and will into a wall of wood and iron, spears jabbing through the narrow gaps. Shields absorbing blow after blow, the front ranks doing the desperate close work while the ranks behind pushed and held and occasionally stepped forward to take a wounded man's place. It was not fast, whatever a film might show you. It was endurance dressed up as violence, a test of which side's collective nerve would give out first. Fought out under a sky that carried on being politely indifferent to the whole affair, and it went on like this for a long while. Hard, grinding, both sides refusing, for hour after aching hour, to be the ones who broke. You can imagine the strange, terrible sameness of it from the inside. The same shield in front of your face, the same grunt and shove and shift of weight, the world narrowed down to the small patch of churned turf in front of you. And the stranger on the other side of it who wanted very badly for you to step backward. Historians describe these Anglo-Saxon shield wall battles as tests less of skill than of sheer collective. Willpower and Eddington, by every account we have, was exactly that kind of test. But something has to give in a contest like that. Eventually, and on this particular day in this particular May, it was Guthrum's Danes who gave first. The wall that had held Wessex hostage in fear since that terrible night at Chippenham began. At last, to loosen, then to bend, then, as these things tend to happen slowly and then all at once, to break entirely. Men turning and running back the way they had come, back across the downs, back toward the safety of their fortress at Chippenham. While behind them the West Saxon line held its ground, held its shape and understood, in the strange quiet way that follows a long fight, that it had won. There is no need to dwell on what happens in the minutes after a shield wall breaks. Let it be enough to say that a fleeing army rarely fares gently. And leave the rest to your own kind imagination rather than mine. What matters here is simply that Alfred's men stood, at the end of it, still standing. Tired beyond words, bruised, thinned in number, but standing on the field where they had started, which in the language of 9th century warfare is as clear and total a victory as anyone could ask for. Here's a small joke to carry you gently past the worst of it. One imagines a great many men on both sides spent that entire brutal afternoon privately regretting every meal they'd skipped that week, because nothing makes a shoving match against the whole Danish army feel longer than doing it on an empty stomach. Here's another, softer one tucked in right behind it. Somewhere in the chaos you can be reasonably confident at least one exhausted Then muttered something rude under his breath. About whoever's idea it had been to fight uphill, a complaint soldiers have been making, one suspects, since the invention of hills. And a third, gentlest of all, Guthrum's men, fleeing back toward Chippenham that evening, were about to discover that a besieged fortress with no food in it is a considerably less comfortable place to spend a fortnight than an open Wiltshire hillside, however violently that hillside had just treated them. Here is your solid fact, plain and dependable. The Battle of Edington, fought at Ithenden in May of 878, is recorded by both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Alfred's biographer Asser as the decisive turning point of the whole Viking crisis in Wessex, the single afternoon on which the kingdom's survival tipped, at last, back onto Alfred's side of the scale. Here is your quirky tidbit, small and strange as ever. The modern village of Edington, quiet and unassuming today, gives its name to a battle that arguably shaped the entire future. Course of the English language and the English crown, which feels, on reflection, like an enormous amount of historical weight to hang on a place most mapmakers would otherwise pass by without comment. And historians still argue whether Edington was truly the masterstroke of brilliant generalship later ages like to credit Alfred with, or whether it was, just as plausibly, a hard-fought, closely balanced contest that could easily have gone the other way had exhaustion or luck tipped differently that afternoon. The sources tell us who won, but they're far less forthcoming about exactly why, leaving scholars to fill the gap with theories and the occasional very heated footnote. For now, though, let the field go quiet in your mind, the shouting fading, the Danes running, the grass already beginning to forget what had just happened upon it. Wessex is still standing tonight. Alfred is still standing tonight. And somewhere beyond that hillside, a fortress at Chippenham is about to learn what it feels like to be surrounded. And the shield wall breaks, and once a shield wall breaks there is only one thing left to do, which is run, and so the Danes run. Streaming back across the churned ground of Eddington with Alfred's men close behind them, all the way to the one place that still feels like safety, the fortress at Chippenham, which happens to be the very same royal hall they had stolen from Alfred on that Black Twelfth night only a few months before. There is something almost too neat about it. The kind of detail you would cut from a story for being too pleased with itself. The king chases the men who chased him out of his own house. All the way back to his own front door. You follow in the cold, mud-flecked wake of the West Saxon army as it comes up on Chippenham's earthworks. And you watch Alfred do something almost as important as anything he did the day before. He does not simply storm the gates. He surrounds the place, digs in, and cuts off the roads and the water and, as far as a 9th century army can, the very air the Danes are breathing, and then he waits. Because a wall this stout is not going to fall to spears, but it is absolutely going to fall to hunger. The siege runs 14 days, 2 full weeks that must have felt, from inside those walls, like the slowest and cruelest kind of ending imaginable. You can imagine what a fortnight without adequate food does to a garrison already worn thin by a hard campaign. And a harder winter. The horses go first, almost certainly. Then whatever grain and salted meat had been laid in starts to run frighteningly low. And cold has a way of making hunger worse, because a body burning itself down to keep warm needs more fuel, not less, and there simply isn't any. Outside the walls, the West Saxon Fyrd is camped in the raw, early summer damp of Wiltshire, with nothing to do but watch smoke rise from a fortress they cannot yet enter. But at least their supply lines run back into a countryside that, for the first time in months, is theirs again. It is one of the plainer, less romantic lessons of medieval warfare. Pitched battles make for stirring poetry, but sieges are won by whoever controls the bread, and for 2 long weeks the bread belongs entirely to Alfred. Here is the one solid fact worth carrying into your dreams tonight. This fortnight-long siege is recorded plainly in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the moment the Danish army's will finally cracked. Hunger and cold succeeding where a whole day of shield-on-shield fighting had only battered them. Proof that the quiet, patient half of warfare can finish what the loud half only starts. And here is a smaller, quirkier thing to tuck away beside it. Somewhere inside those very walls were very likely a few men who had feasted at that same hall back in January. On stores that had, not so long before, belonged to Alfred himself, which means the Danes may well have spent their last desperate days finishing off the king's own Christmas larder. A detail so wonderfully petty you almost wish the chroniclers had thought to mention it outright. 14 days is a strange, oddly specific number for a siege to last. And it is worth noting, gently, that medieval armies were about as good at keeping precise siege calendars as you probably are at remembering how many days it has been since you last. Change the bedsheets, and yet this number survives, written down close to the events, which is one reason historians tend to trust it. 2 weeks of a besieging army just beyond the palisade, patient as weather, waiting for you to run out of everything a body needs. It is not hard to understand why the men inside decide that further resistance has stopped being courage, and started being simply a slower way of dying, and so they do what's starving. Cornered armies have always done. They ask for terms. What follows is not a massacre, and it is worth pausing on that. Because it would have been entirely within the rough grammar of 9th century warfare for Alfred to show no mercy at all to men who had so recently burned him out of his own. Hall? Instead, the Danes sue for peace, and Alfred chooses the harder, wiser path. The terms carry real weight. Hostages are handed over. Valuable men and sometimes kin of the Danish leaders placed into West Saxon keeping as a very literal guarantee of good behaviour. Their safety now tied to whether their own side keeps its word. Solemn oaths are sworn on top of the hostages, oaths that the Danish army will leave Wessex entirely. And here the story takes its strangest, most touching turn. The Danes agree, as part of these same terms, that their King Guthrum will accept Christian baptism. Sit with that for a moment, because it is genuinely odd. This idea of a peace treaty with a religious ceremony folded directly into its terms. As though the surrender document and the christening invitation had somehow been written on the very same scrap of parchment. In this world, faith and politics were never separate rooms in the same house. They were the same room, and a king's god was very much part of a king's authority. So asking a pagan war leader to be baptized was not some gentle afterthought. It was arguably the single most important term in the whole agreement. Striking at the very identity of the Danish leadership in a way mere hostages never could. Historians still argue whether Guthrum's agreement to be baptized was a genuine turn of the heart. Brought on by weeks of hunger and defeat and some quiet private reckoning with his own mortality, or simply the shrewdest political move available to a beaten man who understood exactly what Alfred needed to hear. And the honest, slightly unsatisfying answer is that the two possibilities were probably tangled together in Guthrum's own mind in ways not even Guthrum could have fully untangled. Either way, the fighting is over, at least for now, and you can feel the whole exhausted landscape of Wessex exhale a little. The fields that will, please, be allowed to grow their crops undisturbed this year, the halls that will not be burned, the roads that will carry traders again instead of only armies. It is a remarkably tidy ending to an extremely untidy few months, which is either a credit to Alfred's good sense or simply proof that even the 9th century occasionally allowed its wars. To end the way you'd want a bedtime story to end, with everyone still breathing and a difficult peace instead of a total blood-soaked victory. There is still a strange ceremony to come, still 3 weeks of waiting before anyone sees a Danish war leader kneel at a font. And you will get there soon enough, drifting gently along with the rest of this tired, hopeful kingdom as it makes its slow way toward Allah. 3 weeks pass, 3 quiet weeks of hostages settling into unfamiliar halls and messengers riding back and forth across a Wessex that is, for the first time in a long while, not actively on fire, and then the day arrives that nobody could quite have predicted back in the smoke and confusion of Twelfth Night. The day Guthrum comes to Alfred not with an axe in his hand, but with a small company of his chief men, riding quietly to the village of Allah. Close by the marshes of Athelney, where Alfred himself had so recently been hiding like a hunted animal. You can feel the strangeness of that alone, if you let yourself sit with it. The very same reed beds and water meadows that sheltered a fugitive king only months earlier are now the backdrop for the surrender ceremony of the man who chased him into them. And if you wanted a single image to hold on to for the rest of your life about how quickly fortune can turn in this world, you could do a great deal worse than that one, marsh mist and all. At Alla, in a modest wooden church that has not survived to be visited today, Guthrum is baptised a Christian, and Alfred himself stands as his godfather, which is not some small ceremonial nicety tacked onto the occasion but the entire point of it. In the 9th century, standing godfather to a man was no light thing. It created a bond the sources describe in the language of real kinship, spiritual fatherhood every bit as binding in its own way. As blood, and by taking on that role, Alfred was not merely watching his former enemy get wet. He was formally, deliberately, adopting him into a family, into a Christian brotherhood of kings that carried its own rules about loyalty and honour. It is a genuinely strange kind of ending to a war, not a treaty signed at spear point alone, but a king kneeling at a font while his fiercest enemy holds a cloth over his shoulders and murmurs the responses beside him, and you have to admit, whatever else you think about the 9th century, that it occasionally had a flair for symbolism that modern diplomacy has rather lost the knack for. Guthrum rises from that font a new man, at least on paper, and takes a new name to go with it. Ethelstan, a good solid West Saxon name, the kind a man might have carried since the cradle rather than picked up at 30-odd years old while still dripping from a font in a borrowed church. Try to imagine being on the receiving end of that. Being handed not just a new god, but an entirely new identity, a fresh name to answer to for the rest of your days, as if the whole of your former self. The raids, the winters, the years of hard fighting up and down the length of England could be folded up and set aside the moment the water touched your forehead. Whether Guthrum himself thought of it in quite such tidy terms, whether he lay awake that first night as Ethelstan wondering who exactly he was supposed to be now, is one of the great unanswerable questions of the whole affair, and no source is kind enough to tell us. The ceremony itself does not end at the font, because 9th century baptism for an adult, especially a royal one, involved wearing a white band or cloth, the chrism for a period afterward as a mark of the newly cleansed soul. And the formal loosing of that band, the moment the new Christian is quite literally unwrapped from his baptismal garments and declared fully received into the faith, takes place a little later at Wedmore, a village not far off across the same low Somerset ground. Here is the one solid fact worth tucking away with you tonight. This whole sequence, baptism at Alla and the chrism loosing at Wedmore, is recorded in Asser's Life of King Alfred as a real, deliberate two-stage ritual. Not some vague gesture of surrender, but a formal Christian rite carried out with all the correct steps in all the correct order. Which tells you plainly how seriously both sides were treating the moment, however differently they may privately have felt about it. And then, because apparently no 9th century ceremony is complete without one, the feasting begins, 12 days of it, at Wedmore, Alfred and his household entertaining Guthrum and his chief men with food and drink, and notably gifts, generous ones. handed over by the very king whose kingdom these men had so recently tried to erase from the map. 12 days is a suspiciously familiar number if you were paying attention earlier in this story, because it is exactly as long as the Christmas feasting Alfred had been enjoying at Chippenham, on the night everything fell apart. And you have to wonder whether anyone in that hall at Wedmore noticed the echo, whether some quietly exhausted steward, laying out cups for the 12th day running, allowed himself one small private thought about the sheer, relentless persistence of hospitality as a West Saxon coping mechanism. Here is a smaller, quirkier detail worth carrying into sleep alongside it. Not every Dane in that company took to the white chrism robes with good grace, and later tradition remembers a certain grumbling resentment among some of Guthrum's men at being dressed up like Christian. Penitence after a lifetime of answering to entirely different gods. Proof, if you needed it, that not everybody enjoys a costume change, even when their life rather depends on it. Historians still argue whether the choice of Allah, so close to Athelney, was a piece of deliberate and rather pointed symbolism on Alfred's part. Baptizing his defeated enemy within sight of the very marshes that had sheltered him at his lowest ebb, or whether it was simply the nearest suitable church to hand and the poetry. Of it is something we have layered on afterward because we like our history to rhyme. Either reading tells you something true, history rarely hands you tidy symbolism on purpose. But it is remarkably generous about leaving the pieces lying around for later storytellers, sleepy YouTube narrators included, to arrange into shapes that feel meaningful. What matters? As the 12 days wind down and the gifts are given, and the Danish company finally rides off toward whatever comes next, is that a war which began with an axe through a hall door on the coldest night of the year has ended with a christening, a new name. And a very long feast, which is, when you think about it, a rather more hopeful way for a 9th century war story to end than most. Guthrum, or Ethelstan as he must now learn to answer to, keeps his word, and that in itself is worth pausing on. Because solemn oaths in the 9th century were broken about as often as they were kept, and yet this particular Dane, freshly dripping and freshly named, actually withdraws his army from Wessex the way he promised, leading his men away northeastward across a countryside that must have watched them go with a very cautious, very tired kind of relief. He does not vanish from the story, though, not for years yet, because a man does not simply stop being a king once he has been baptized. And in time, the sources place it a year or two later, around 879 or 880, Guthrum leads his people into East Anglia and settles there. Taking up the old kingdom that had lost its own King Edmund to Danish arrows nearly a decade before, and ruling it now not as a raiding warlord passing through. But as something closer to a resident king, minting his own coins, in fact, some of them stamped with his new Christian name. Which is either a rather touching sign of how seriously he took his new identity, or a very practical bit of 9th century branding, and honestly it is probably both at once. With Guthrum settled and the immediate danger past, Wessex and the Danish-held lands need something they have never really needed before, which is a line, an actual agreed boundary. Sat down and worked out in careful, deliberate language, marking where Alfred's England ends and Guthrum's does not. That boundary, when it comes, is a genuinely remarkable document for its time. It runs up the River Thames, then follows the River Lee northward, cuts overland to Bedford, picks up the River Ouse, and finally meets the old Roman road of Watling Street, tracing a line across the map of England that two kings who had, not so long before, been trying to kill each other now agree to treat as real and binding. It is worth sitting with how strange that is. Two rivers and Roman road pressed into service as the spine of a peace. Because the 9th century did not have surveyors with theodolites, it had rivers that did not move. And roads the Romans had left lying about 4 centuries earlier, still doing useful work long after the empire that built them had crumbled into rumour. Here is the one solid fact worth carrying into your dreams tonight. This agreement, the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, is a real surviving document. Not myth or later flattery, and the territory it hands over to Danish rule, East Anglia and the eastern part of Mercia. Stretching up through the old kingdom of Northumbria becomes over time the region history remembers as the Danelaw, a great swathe of England where Scandinavian custom, Scandinavian law and eventually Scandinavian words would sit alongside English ones for generations, and here is a smaller, quirkier thing to tuck away beside it. The word Danelaw itself is not something Alfred or Guthrum would ever have used or recognised, because it only enters the written record more than a century later. Which means an entire enormous region of England has been walking around for 1,000 years wearing a name its original inhabitants never actually gave it, rather like discovering that everyone has been calling your childhood bedroom by a nickname you never once heard growing up. Alfred, meanwhile, does not spend his hard-won peace simply resting on it, tempting as that must have been after a winter and spring that would have flattened a lesser man entirely. Instead, he turns, with what can only be described as a rather alarming amount of energy for someone who was recently hiding in a swamp, to the slow, unglamorous work of making sure this particular crisis never happens to Wessex again. He begins building a network of fortified towns, burhs scattered across the kingdom at intervals close enough that, in time, no West Saxon would find himself more than roughly a day's walk from a defended wall behind which he and his family and his livestock could shelter if the raiders ever came again. These are not castles in the later medieval sense, nothing so grand as that, but earth ramparts and timber palisades wrapped around existing towns and new ones alike. Garrisoned by men drawn from the surrounding countryside under an arrangement recorded eventually in a document called the Burgel Hidage, a sort of 9th century muster roll listing exactly how many hides of land, and therefore how many men each burh was owed for its upkeep and defence. You have to admire the sheer, patient administrative stubbornness of it. Honestly, because winning a battle is a single dramatic afternoon, the kind of thing bards can sing about with a straight face. But building an entire kingdom-wide network of fortifications, negotiating with every ealdorman and thegn about how many men and how much labour each district owes, is the sort of unglamorous bureaucratic slog that never once shows up in a saga, and yet it is very possibly the single most important thing Alfred does in the whole of his reign, more important in the long run than even the shield wall at Edington. He is, in effect, spending the rest of his life quietly making sure that no 12th Night ever catches Wessex unprepared again, which is either the most sensible response imaginable to nearly losing everything, or a rather charming case of a man who, having survived one truly terrible camping trip, resolves never to be caught without proper shelter again. Historians still argue over exactly how much of the fully developed birth system belongs to Alfred himself, in these years right after Eddington, and how much was extended and refined later by his children, particularly his son Edward and his daughter Ethelflaed, who each carried the project further into Mercia and beyond. The sources are frustratingly thin on the precise timeline, and untangling what the father started from what the children finished has kept scholars arguing for a very long time indeed. What is not in doubt is the shape of the kingdom Alfred is quietly rebuilding, county by county, wall by wall, out of the wreckage of that terrible winter. A Wessex no longer merely lucky to have survived, but one that is, plank by plank and rampart by rampart, being made rather harder to burn down a second time. With the walls rising and the boundary settled, Alfred turns his attention to a battle that never once required a shield, though. He seems to have taken it just as seriously as the one at Eddington, and that is the slow, quiet catastrophe of a kingdom that has almost entirely forgotten how to read. In the preface he later writes to his translation of Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, Alfred does not mince words about it, and there is a real, aching grief in what he sets down. He laments that learning had decayed so badly across England that, by his own reckoning, very few men south of the River Humber could even translate a letter of Latin out of Latin into their own tongue, and fewer still could manage it the other way around. So that the great libraries of earlier, more settled generations sat half understood, their wisdom locked behind a language almost nobody left alive could still unlock. You have to picture what that actually means in practice. Monasteries founded generations earlier, specifically to preserve and copy learning, now holding shelves of books that even their own resident monks could barely make sense of, a kingdom sitting on top of a treasury of knowledge with the key rusted. Shut, which is either a deeply sad image or the single best argument in recorded history for keeping up with your homework. So Alfred does something almost nobody in his position would have thought to prioritise amid burh building and boundary treaties, and gathers scholars around him, drawing in learned men from wherever he can find them, from Mercia, from the continent, and notably from Wales, where he recruits a monk named Asa, who becomes not only a close companion, and eventually Bishop of Sherborne, but the man who will, in the year 893, write the life of King Alfred. The very biography that has handed down to us so much of what we now know about the king, including, one suspects, a fair amount of very flattering shading around the rougher edges. It is a slightly funny thing to sit with, honestly, that so much of what you have been told across this whole long story comes to you filtered through a devoted admirer's pen. Which means you have been listening this whole time to something not unlike Alfred's own carefully curated highlight reel. Not false, necessarily, but definitely edited by someone who liked him rather a lot. With his little court school assembled, Alfred sets these scholars, and eventually takes up the pen himself to the enormous task of turning the great Latin works of Christian learning into English, so that a nobleman's son who would never master Latin might still read wisdom in the only language he actually owned. Gregory's Pastoral Care comes into English this way, as does Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, a book written by a Roman senator awaiting execution, and somehow, centuries later, still finding fresh readers among worried West Saxon Thegans. Augustine's soliloquies follows, along with the first 50 psalms, rendered into the rhythms of English rather than Latin, so that prayer itself might be spoken and understood in the same breath. Alfred also lends his weight and his patronage to the compiling of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that great sprawling, year-by-year record of English history that monks up and down the kingdom will go on quietly adding to for more than 2 centuries after his death, which means, in a very real sense, that the entire story you have been drifting through tonight exists at all, partly because one exhausted 9th century king decided that a kingdom without its own history written down in its own language was a kingdom halfway to forgetting itself. Here is the one solid fact worth carrying gently into sleep. Alfred did not merely commission these translations from a safe distance, he is understood, on the evidence of his own words and Assayer's testimony, to have personally worked at learning Latin himself as an adult king in the midst of war and governance. Wrestling with grammar and vocabulary the way any late-blooming student does, which makes him almost certainly the only early English king who can be shown to have sat down. Past the age of 40 and done his own homework. And here is a smaller, quirkier thing to hold alongside it. In 1693, deep in the soft, marshy ground near Athelney, not far from the very refuge where Alfred once hid from Guthrum's army, a farmer turned up a small, extraordinary object. A teardrop-shaped setting of gold and rock crystal and vivid cloisonné enamel, now known simply as the Alfred jewel, bearing round its edge an inscription in Old English that reads, quite plainly, "Alfred ordered me to be made," a sentence so understated for something this beautiful that you have to appreciate the restraint of it. A king casually signing his name to a masterpiece the way you might sign a birthday card. What the jewel was actually for is not entirely settled. And this is precisely the sort of pleasant, unresolved puzzle that historians love to argue about deep into the night. The leading theory holds that it was an estel, a pointer meant to be attached to a slender rod and used for following the lines of text in a manuscript. Quite possibly one of the very books Alfred had sent out to bishoprics across his kingdom, though nobody can say for certain. And other, less popular theories about ceremonial pendants and crown ornaments still get their occasional airing at conferences. Historians still argue whether it truly served this humble, practical purpose of pointing along a line of scripture, or whether something so lavishly made was always intended as much for display and prestige as for reading. A small golden reminder, worn or carried, of exactly whose court had brought books back into fashion. It is worth knowing, as you drift now toward the last stretch of this long story, that the title history remembers him by, Alfred the Great, the only English king ever to carry that particular epithet without irony or argument, did not actually attach itself to him in his own lifetime, or for a very long while afterward, but only gradually, centuries later from around the 16th century onward, as later writers looking back at the wreckage of 878 and the Burrs and the books that followed decided that no other English king before or since had quite so thoroughly earned it. And that is where you leave him, really. Not on a battlefield, not in a burning hall, but somewhere quieter, an older king bent over a half-translated page by candlelight. The war long behind him, the kingdom slowly knitting itself back together, field by field, wall by wall, book by book. You can let Wessex go now. Gently, the way you might let go of a hand you have been holding all evening. The marshes of Athelney settle back into stillness, reeds bending slow in a wind you cannot hear. The fires at Wedmore have burned down to soft grey ash. The new walls of the burghs stand quiet under a late summer sky, unfinished, unhurried, waiting for nothing in particular tonight. Somewhere a scribe sets down his pen, somewhere a bell, far off, rings the hour and then stops. You do not need to carry any of it any further than this. Let the shield walls rest. Let the ships stay beached on their far dark shores. Let the kings sleep, if kings ever really do, and let yourself sleep now too. Because that was always where this was taking you, all along, gliding gently backward through centuries only so you might come forward again into your own soft, dark, ordinary room. Your own blankets, your own quiet breathing. There is nothing left to watch for tonight. No messenger riding hard through the dark. No smoke on the horizon, only the slow, even hush of a very old story finally settling. The way a fire settles, the way a house settles, the way you are settling now. Deeper and deeper into the pillow, into the mattress, into the dark. Rest now. You have walked the whole of it, and it is enough. Let it go.